I buried my special forces past to give my daughter a safe and peaceful childhood. But when my wealthy brother-in-law grabbed my shoulder in front of her and hissed that he would put me in a wheelchair and take my child away, I stayed perfectly calm. He mistook my silence for fear, and in doing so, he made the one threat he could never ever take back. Before I tell you exactly what he said, and the brutal lesson he was about to learn, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you believe that true strength is about protecting the people you love. Drop a comment and let me know what city or state you are watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single one, and I love seeing where this community reaches. Now, let me take you back to the afternoon when the mask I had worn for 2 years finally began to slip. My name is Caleb. I am 34 years old. On paper, I am the most unremarkable man you could ever meet. I work as a corporate compliance officer for a mid-sized logistics firm in suburban Dallas, Texas. I spend my days reviewing supply chain contracts, flagging regulatory discrepancies, and sitting in beige cubicles. It is a quiet, predictable life, and that is exactly how I designed it. I am a single father to a beautiful 6-year-old girl named Lily. 2 years ago, I held my wife as she took her final breath after a brutal, rapid battle with pancreatic cancer. Losing her shattered my world, but it left me with one singular defining purpose. I had to protect Lily. I had to give her the stable, loving, completely ordinary childhood that Chloe had always dreamed for her. To do that, I had to bury who I used to be. Before the corporate suits, before the logistics firm, I was a Green Beret medic. I spent 8 years conducting Tier 1 operations in places that do not exist on official maps. I was trained to assess threats in a fraction of a second, to dismantle enemies with clinical precision, and to stay hyper-vigilant in the most chaotic environments on Earth. But you cannot raise a little girl in the suburbs while carrying the posture of a soldier waiting for an ambush. So I packed away my uniforms. I locked my medals in a box in the attic. I softened my voice. I slouched my shoulders, and I learned how to be the mild-mannered, grieving widower. I played the part so well that my late wife's family bought it completely. Chloe's older sister Sarah and her husband Travis were the unofficial royalty of our local megachurch. Travis was 39, a charismatic, deeply tanned commercial real estate developer who wore custom-tailored suits to Sunday service and drove a slate gray Porsche. Sarah was the perfect socialite wife, always dressed in designer brands, always organizing charity bake sales, and always looking down her nose at me. Ever since Chloe passed, Travis and Sarah treated me like a pathetic charity case. They invited Lily and me to their massive 5,000-square-foot home for Sunday dinners, not out of love, but out of a desperate need to perform their own generosity for their wealthy friends. They saw me as a broken, traumatized veteran who was barely holding his life together. They constantly offered passive-aggressive parenting advice. They criticized the modest neighborhood I lived in. They bought Lily wildly expensive gifts, just to remind me that I could not afford them on a compliance officer's salary. I swallowed my pride and endured it. I smiled and thanked them. I let them treat me like a doormat because I wanted Lily to have a relationship with her aunt and uncle. I wanted her to feel surrounded by family. I told myself that my ego was a small price to pay for my daughter's happiness. I had no idea that my silence was inviting a predator right to our doorstep. It was a blistering Sunday afternoon in late June. We were at Travis and Sarah's sprawling house for a post-church barbecue. The backyard looked like a country club. There was a massive saltwater pool and outdoor kitchen with a custom smoker and dozens of people from their church and country club laughing and holding crystal glasses of sweet tea and expensive beer. I was standing in the massive indoor kitchen trying to stay out of the way, pouring a cup of water from the refrigerator. The noise of the party was a dull roar through the open glass patio doors. That was when Travis cornered me. He walked into the kitchen, shutting the heavy glass door behind him, cutting off the sounds of the party. The sudden quiet was deliberate. He stood between me and the exit. He was holding a beer, smiling that perfect cap-tooth smile, but his eyes were entirely dead. "Caleb, buddy. We need to talk business," Travis said, his voice dripping with forced casualness. I took a sip of my water. What kind of business, Travis? He stepped closer, invading my personal space, a classic corporate intimidation tactic. I am putting together a massive commercial development deal down in Austin. It is a guaranteed win. Zero risk, pure profit. I am letting a few close family members in on the ground floor. I am happy for you, Travis, I said mildly, keeping my voice soft. But you know I do not have that kind of capital to invest. Travis chuckled, a wet, condescending sound. Do not play dumb with me, Caleb. I know exactly what you have. I am talking about Chloe's life insurance trust. My heart did a slow, heavy thump against my ribs, but my face remained a blank, pleasant mask. Before Chloe died, she set up a specific life insurance trust for Lily, totaling $300,000. It was untouchable money meant solely for Lily's college education, her first home, and her future security. Because I was deployed so often early in our marriage, Chloe had legally appointed Travis as the co-trustee, trusting her successful, wealthy brother-in-law to help manage the paperwork if anything ever happened to her. That money is for Lily, I said quietly. It is in a locked trust. It is not for real estate investments. Travis rolled his eyes, taking another step forward. Caleb, do not be an idiot. The market is hot. You are letting that money rot in a low-yield account. I can double it in 18 months. You just need to sign the release authorizing me to liquidate the trust and roll it into my new LLC. It is a family investment. I am doing you a favor. I set my water glass down on the granite counter. The mild-mannered accountant routine was getting harder to maintain, but I kept my voice perfectly level. I appreciate the offer, Travis, but the answer is no. That money stays exactly where it is. Chloe wanted it safe for Lily, and I am going to honor that. Travis's smile vanished. The charismatic church leader evaporated, leaving behind something incredibly ugly and deeply entitled. He set his beer bottle down on the island with a sharp clack. You do not get to say no to me in my own house, you ungrateful loser. Travis hissed, the veins in his neck suddenly visible. I am the co-trustee. I have financial authority. But the bank needs your signature to release the funds without a massive penalty. So you are going to sign the release, Caleb. You are going to sign it by Friday. I looked at him. I did not glare. I did not puff out my chest. I just looked at him with the cold, deadpan assessment of a man calculating the exact distance between a threat and a neutralization. I think we are done talking, Travis, I said, turning to walk past him toward the hallway. He moved fast. He reached out and grabbed my left shoulder, his heavy manicured hand digging viciously into my muscle. He did not know it, but his thumb pressed directly into a faded, jagged scar just below my collarbone. It was the entry wound from a 7.62mm round I took during an ambush in the mountains of Afghanistan. A ghost of old pain flared hot and sharp through my chest. Every single instinct ingrained in me by the United States Army Special Forces screamed at me to react. The muscle memory was overwhelming. Step inside his guard, control the wrist, break the elbow, drive him into the granite floor. It would have taken less than 2 seconds. I could have shattered his arm before he even registered he was falling. My breathing slowed. My vision tunneled. The suburban kitchen faded away. But then I heard the soft patter of footsteps on the hardwood floor. Daddy, I froze. My daughter Lily was standing in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the hallway. She was wearing her little yellow sundress, holding a paper plate with a half-eaten hot dog on it. Her big brown eyes darted between me and her uncle. She could sense the tension. Children always do. The soldier vanished instantly. The father returned. If I dropped her uncle to the floor, if I shattered his bones and let the violence out of its cage, Lily would see it. She would see the monster I had tried so hard to leave overseas. She would be terrified of me. I refused to let that happen. Travis saw Lily too. Without missing a beat, his face morphed back into a warm, joyful mask. Hey there, sweetie pie. Did you get enough to eat? He beamed at her, his voice booming and friendly. Lily nodded shyly, taking a step toward me. Travis kept his hand clamped tightly on my scarred shoulder. He leaned his face in close to my ear, keeping his back to Lily, so she could not see his expression. He dropped his voice to a venomous, barely audible whisper. Sign the release by Friday. Travis hissed into my ear. Or I swear to God I will put you in a wheelchair and I will have Sarah take custody of that little girl. Who do you think the family court is going to believe, a wealthy, respected pillar of the community, or a traumatized, widowed veteran who cannot even afford a decent house? You will lose everything, Caleb. A cold, absolute silence descended over my mind. It was a specific kind of silence. I had only felt it a few times in my life. It was the silence right before you call in an airstrike. Travis squeezed my shoulder one last time, giving it a patronizing pat, and then stepped back. He smiled broadly at Lily. Your daddy and I were just talking about how much we love you, kiddo. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I gently brushed my hand over my shoulder where he had grabbed me, smoothing my shirt. I looked at Travis. He was smirking. He saw my lack of physical retaliation, my silence, as absolute cowardice. He thought I was broken. He thought the threat of taking my daughter had terrified me into submission. I walked over to Lily, kneeling down to her level and smiling warmly. Hey, baby girl. Are you ready to go home? She nodded, rubbing her tired eyes. Yes, Daddy. I stood up, holding her small hand in mine. I looked back at Travis one last time. Have a good afternoon, Travis. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the marble counter, looking victorious. See you Friday, Caleb. Do not forget your pen. I led Lily out the front door, strapped her into her car seat, and drove away from the sprawling mansion. The Texas sun was blinding, but inside the car the air conditioning hummed quietly. Lily fell asleep in the back seat within 10 minutes, her little head resting against the window. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Travis thought he had won. He thought he had bullied a weak, grieving accountant into handing over a fortune. He thought his money and his status made him untouchable. But as I drove back to our quiet, modest home, the protective instincts that had kept me alive in war zones were fully, irreversibly activated. Travis had made a fatal miscalculation. He had threatened the physical safety of a Green Beret. He had threatened to take away my daughter. I thought he was dealing with prey. He had no idea he had just locked himself in a cage with a predator. I was not going to call the police. I was not going to argue with him. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire life, strip away every piece of wealth and dignity he possessed, and expose him to the light of day. The first step was finding out exactly why a wealthy, supposedly successful real estate developer was so desperate for $300,000 in cash that he was willing to commit assault and extortion to get it. When we got home, I put Lily to bed, kissed her forehead, and closed her door. I walked into my home office, turned on my computer, and dropped the mask of the mild-mannered compliance officer. It was time to go to work. Once the door to my daughter's bedroom clicked shut, the mild-mannered suburban father ceased to exist. I stood in the quiet hallway of my modest Dallas home and listened to the steady rhythm of Lily breathing through the baby monitor in my pocket. She was safe. She was deeply asleep, completely unaware of the monsters circling our lives. But the phantom pressure of Travis gripping my scarred shoulder lingered on my skin like a burning ember. I walked down the hall toward my home office, my footsteps entirely silent on the hardwood floor. Muscle memory is a fascinating and stubborn thing. For 2 long years, I had deliberately trained myself to walk heavily, to let my shoulders slump, to embody the tired, grieving accountant everyone expected me to be. Tonight my posture was bone straight. My breathing was slow, deliberate, and perfectly measured. The mask I wore for the world had finally slipped off. I unlocked the heavy oak door to my office and stepped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of a street lamp filtering through the closed blinds. But I did not reach for the light switch. I sat down at my desk, booted up my custom-built computer, and cracked my knuckles. Travis genuinely thought he was dealing with a corporate paper pusher. He thought he could bully a weak widower into handing over a fortune just by using his physical size and his country club status. What my arrogant brother-in-law did not understand was that my day job as a corporate compliance officer was simply a civilian application of the intelligence gathering skills I had perfected in the Special Forces. I hunted financial anomalies for a living. I dismantled complex international supply chain frauds before I even finished my morning coffee. Tracking the sloppy digital footprints of a local real estate developer was not going to be a challenge. It was going to be an execution. My first target was the life insurance trust. When my wife Chloe was first diagnosed with cancer, the disease moved through her body with terrifying speed. In her final months, terrified for our daughter's future, she set up a $300,000 irrevocable trust for Lily. At the time, I was still deployed overseas running classified Tier 1 operations in mountains that do not exist on any official map. Chloe desperately needed someone stateside, someone she trusted, who was legally bound to manage the complicated banking paperwork if the worst happened before the military could send me home. Travis had played the role of the supportive, wealthy brother-in-law flawlessly. He stood by her hospital bed and promised Chloe he would co-manage the fund, ensuring Lily would always have a guaranteed college education and a down payment for her first house. For the past 2 years, Travis had been sending me heavily redacted quarterly reports. They were dense, jargon-heavy PDF files that always showed modest, steady growth. To a grieving husband who was busy learning how to braid hair and pack lunchboxes, they looked like standard financial updates. But tonight, I was not looking at those documents through the eyes of a grieving husband. I opened the encrypted solid-state drive where I stored my most advanced compliance software, the exact kind of forensic tools my logistics firm used to audit offshore shell companies. I ran Travis's PDFs through a metadata extractor. Travis was incredibly arrogant, but he was also fundamentally lazy. He had simply placed black digital boxes over the routing numbers and the transaction histories using a basic editing program. He had not properly flattened the files to permanently erase the data beneath them. Within 4 short minutes, my forensic software stripped away his digital black ink. The raw, unfiltered financial data stared back at me, glowing stark white against the dark screen of my monitor. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the endless columns of numbers. My heart, which had been beating with a cold, predatory calm, suddenly skipped a beat in my chest. The $300,000 was gone. I blinked, assuming I had misread the ledger. I immediately ran a secondary trace utilizing open-source intelligence techniques I had learned while tracking insurgent funding networks overseas. I cross-referenced the newly uncovered trust account routing numbers with public banking databases and state property tax records. The truth materialized on my monitors in undeniable, horrifying detail. Travis had not just threatened me at the barbecue this afternoon to get his hands on the money. He had already drained the entire trust fund 6 months ago, every single dollar. Chloe had left for our daughter. The money meant to secure Lily's entire future had been wired out in 3 rapid sequential transfers last December. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I tracked the routing numbers through the digital ether. The cash had been funneled directly into a holding account for one of Travis's commercial real estate limited liability companies. But an irrevocable trust is heavily regulated. It requires the total value of the assets to remain whole. Travis knew the banking regulations, so he had attempted to cover his tracks with a sickening legal loophole. He had replaced the $300,000 in cash with promissory notes from his own company. He had effectively written an IOU from his failing business to a 6-year-old girl, declaring the worthless paper as an equivalent financial asset. A suffocating heavy wave of absolute rage washed over me. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering. This man had stood in my kitchen just hours ago, smiling warmly at my daughter, calling her sweetie pie, knowing full well he had already robbed her blind. He had grabbed my shoulder, pressed his thumb into a bullet wound I had earned serving my country, and threatened to put me in a wheelchair if I did not sign a release form. Now the puzzle pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Travis did not need my signature to invest the money. He needed my signature to retroactively authorize the massive theft he had already committed. He was trying to force me to legalize his crime before the bank's annual audit triggered an automatic federal review. I pushed my heavy leather chair back from the desk, my breathing suddenly ragged and shallow. The anger was a physical, crushing weight in my chest. Every violent instinct I had buried when I left the military screamed at me to act. I wanted to drive back to his sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion. I wanted to kick his custom mahogany front door off its hinges, drag him out of his expensive bed and show him exactly what a highly trained, traumatized veteran could do with his bare hands in the dark. It would take less than 2 minutes. It would be so incredibly easy. But violence is loud, and loud is exactly what a man like Travis wanted. If I called the local police or if I drove over there and confronted him physically, I would be playing right into his hands. Travis was a wealthy, influential pillar of the community who played golf every Sunday with the chief of police. He donated heavily to the mayor's re-election campaign. The moment a local squad car rolled up to his gated estate, his high-priced corporate lawyers would immediately spin the narrative. They would tell the police I was a disgruntled, mentally unstable veteran having a violent episode. They would eagerly use my special forces record against me to prove I was dangerous. While I was locked in a holding cell, Travis would have more than enough time to shred the original forged documents, move the remaining stolen assets into offshore accounts, and destroy any chance I ever had of recovering Lily's money. No local law enforcement was a complete dead end. To take down a predator with Travis's level of local influence and money, I needed federal weight. I needed the kind of overwhelming, undeniable legal and financial force that shatters a man's entire existence before he even realizes he is under attack. I needed to build a forensic case so absolutely watertight that a federal judge would freeze his assets instantly without a hearing. I pulled my chair back to the desk and cracked my knuckles a second time. The hot, blinding rage slowly receded, replaced by an absolute chilling focus. If a man as wealthy as Travis was desperate enough to steal from his own 6-year-old niece, his company was not just struggling, it was drowning. And desperate drowning men always leave a massive digital trail of blood. I began pulling every public record tied to his real estate empire. I relentlessly scraped Texas state tax databases, searched county property line registries, and dug through obscure municipal planning permits. I was hunting for the leak, the fatal financial flaw in his business that had forced him to drain Lily's trust in the first place. My screen filled with hundreds of pages of legal filings. I traced the stolen money from his corporate holding account directly to a massive, half-finished commercial development down in Austin. The project was completely stalled. The financial reports painted a picture of absolute catastrophe. General contractors had filed dozens of mechanics' liens for unpaid construction work. The primary commercial lender was threatening immediate foreclosure. Travis was bleeding cash from every single pore of his fabricated hollow empire. He was running a sinking ship and using my daughter's future to plug the holes. But as I dug deeper into the loan origination documents for that specific failing Austin project, my eyes caught a glaring discrepancy. The commercial loan was for $500,000. The dates on the digital timestamps showed the loan was secured just 3 weeks before my wife passed away. A loan of that size for a struggling developer required a secondary guarantor because Travis's personal credit was already massively overextended. I pulled up the digitized PDF of the final loan guarantee agreement, my eyes scanning past the dense legal jargon. I zoomed in on the signature line at the very bottom of the final page. The breath instantly left my lungs. The temperature in my home office seemed to drop 10 degrees. The room tilted. There, scrawled in bright blue ink on the guarantor line, was my late wife's signature. I sat frozen, staring at the glowing monitor, my blood running like ice water through my veins. It was Chloe's name, but it was absolutely not her handwriting. I knew every curve, every slant of her script. I had spent the last 2 years running my fingers over her name on old birthday cards, just to feel close to her. The signature on the screen was a clumsy, rushed imitation. Travis had not just stolen my daughter's future. He had stooped to the lowest possible level of human depravity. He had forged his dying sister-in-law's signature to fraudulently secure $500,000 in commercial debt while she was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. The implications hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Because Texas is a strict community property state, that forged signature meant the commercial bank had direct collateral against our marital assets. If Travis defaulted on this massive Austin loan, which my forensic audit showed was going to happen any day now, the debt would not just wipe out his fraudulent company. The liability would automatically fall directly on the surviving spouse. It would fall entirely on me. The trap he had set was not just about hiding the stolen trust fund money. Travis was about to let the bank foreclose on my assets to pay his debts. He was going to let them take the very house where my daughter was currently sleeping. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows across my office. Travis thought he was playing a game of suburban chess with a grieving accountant. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to dismantle an enemy's entire life piece by piece. Calling the police was no longer an option. Calling a lawyer was not enough. I was going to tear his empire down to the studs, and I was going to make sure he watched it happen. The amber glow of my monitors was the only light in the office. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and rubbed my eyes. My heart was still hammering a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs. Discovering that Travis had already drained my daughter's life insurance trust was a devastating blow. It was a betrayal so profound it defied logic. But in my line of work as a corporate compliance officer and from my years running intelligence operations in the military, I knew one absolute truth. When a predator gets desperate enough to steal from a child, that theft is rarely an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger infection. I leaned forward and placed my hands back on the keyboard. I needed to see the entire disease. Travis operated a commercial real estate firm. To the outside world, and especially to the congregation at our massive local church, he was a massive success. He drove luxury cars, wore custom Italian suits, and hosted lavish charity dinners. But real wealth is quiet. Fake wealth is incredibly loud, and fake wealth always leaves a sloppy paper trail. I bypassed the superficial public records and started digging into the deep municipal filings, the contractor lien registries, and the commercial loan databases for the state of Texas. I was looking for the financial black hole that had swallowed Lily's $300,000. It took me less than an hour to find it. The screen filled with hundreds of pages of legal filings connected to a massive half-finished commercial development project down in Austin. The project was completely dead in the water. General contractors had filed multiple mechanics liens against the property for unpaid invoices. Suppliers were suing for breach of contract. The foundation had been poured, but the steel framing had been abandoned for months. But the most glaring red flag was the primary commercial loan. It was a mezzanine loan for $500,000 secured from a mid-sized regional bank known for aggressive lending practices and high interest rates. I pulled up the digital copy of the loan origination file. The digital timestamp indicated the loan was finalized nearly 2 years ago. I stared at the date on the screen, a cold prickle of dread washing over the back of my neck. That date was exactly 3 weeks before my wife Chloe lost her battle with cancer. During those final weeks, we were practically living in the oncology ward of the hospital. I was sleeping on a terrible vinyl chair holding her hand, watching her fade away day by day. Travis had visited frequently, playing the role of the devoted, supportive older brother to absolute perfection. He would bring expensive coffee offer to handle our household mail and tell me to just focus entirely on Chloe. I zoomed in on the loan documents, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon and the complex liability clauses. Travis was already heavily leveraged across multiple failing properties. His personal credit could never have secured a $500,000 commercial loan on its own. The bank required a secondary guarantor, someone with a pristine financial history and solid unencumbered assets to co-sign the massive debt. I scrolled down past the amortization schedules and the default penalties to the final page, the primary signature block. The air rushed completely out of my lungs. The temperature in my home office seemed to plummet 10 degrees in a single second. There, scrawled in bright blue ink on the guarantor line, was my wife's name, Chloe Elizabeth Sterling. I froze. I stopped breathing entirely. I leaned in so close to the monitor that the pixels blurred together. I knew my wife's handwriting better than I knew my own face in the mirror. I had spent the last 2 years running my fingers over the grocery lists she left behind, tracing the loops of her letters on old birthday cards, just to feel connected to her memory. The signature on this commercial loan document was a clumsy, rushed imitation. It captured the basic shape of her first name, but the slant was completely wrong. The pressure marks on the loops were heavy and aggressive, entirely lacking the graceful, sweeping motion Chloe always used when she signed official papers. Travis had forged her signature, while his younger sister was lying in a hospital bed, dying of aggressive pancreatic cancer. Travis had stolen her identity to guarantee $500,000 in toxic commercial debt. The sheer depravity of the act hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He had not just robbed his 6-year-old niece of her future college education. He had weaponized his dying sister's good name to prop up his failing ego and his collapsing business empire. The rage that flared inside me was hot, blinding, and absolute. I wanted to destroy him. I wanted to drive back to his sprawling mansion, tear down his pristine, arrogant facade, and show the world the absolute monster hiding underneath his expensive clothes. But the analytical side of my brain, the Green Beret medic trained to assess the battlefield under heavy enemy fire, violently wrestled the anger down. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, counting the seconds. Panic and rage are a soldier's worst enemies in a survival situation. I needed to understand the tactical geometry of the trap Travis had laid for me. I opened a new browser window and pulled up the Texas property and family legal codes. Texas is a strict community property state. That means any debt acquired by one spouse during the marriage is generally considered a joint liability, especially if it involves marital assets being pledged as collateral. By forging Chloe's signature as a guarantor on that commercial loan, Travis had legally tethered his failing real estate business directly to our household finances. And because the Austin loan was currently in default, the regional bank would not care that the signature was a blatant forgery. To their legal department, it was a binding contract until proven otherwise in a protracted federal court battle. I cross-referenced the collateral clauses in the loan agreement with my own county property records. The realization struck me with terrifying crystal-clear clarity. The primary asset listed to back up Chloe's forged guarantee was the house I was sitting in right now. The modest, quiet suburban home where my little girl was currently sleeping down the hall. The home where Chloe and I had planned to build our entire lives together. Travis knew exactly what he was doing. His Austin development project was collapsing entirely. The regional bank was preparing to initiate hostile foreclosure proceedings on his limited liability company. When that happened, the bank would automatically trigger the guarantor clause to recover their $500,000. They would place a massive, inescapable lien on my home. They would force a property sale, kick me and Lily out onto the street, and seize all the equity we had built to cover Travis's fraudulent debt. This was never just about a casual family real estate investment. When Travis cornered me at the Sunday barbecue this afternoon, pressing his heavy thumb into my old bullet wound and threatening to put me in a wheelchair, he was not trying to intimidate me into investing Lily's trust fund. He had already stolen the trust fund 6 months ago. He was trying to terrorize me into signing over the physical deed to my house. He wanted me to voluntarily transfer ownership of my property to his failing company under the guise of a safe family investment. If I did that, he could use the remaining equity in my house to appease the angry bankers just long enough to avoid criminal fraud charges. He was planning to sacrifice my home, my daughter's safety, and my entire financial future to save his own skin. And he intended to do it all while playing the role of the generous, wealthy brother-in-law saving the poor, traumatized veteran from mysterious financial ruin. I thought I was weak. He thought the heavy grief of losing my wife had broken my spirit. He looked at my modest corporate job, my quiet demeanor, and my refusal to engage in petty conflict, and he saw a perfect compliant victim. He had absolutely no idea that my silence was not surrender. It was rigorous military discipline. It was the calculated, icy patience of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a threat completely systematically and permanently. I stood up from my desk and paced the length of my office. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under my feet. I could not go to the local police department with this information. Travis was too deeply entrenched in the local suburban power structure. He played golf every weekend with the mayor. He was a major financial donor to the Police Benevolent Fund. If I walked into the local precinct with printed copies of a forged commercial loan, Travis's high-priced corporate lawyers would spin a narrative before I even finished giving my official statement. They would claim I was a disgruntled, grieving widower, suffering from severe military trauma. They would eagerly say I was paranoid and confused about complex financial matters. The local authorities would delay the investigation out of respect for his status, and that delay would give Travis all the time he needed to destroy the original forged documents, move the remaining stolen money offshore, and finalize the devastating foreclosure on my house. I needed a weapon much heavier and much more ruthless than local law enforcement. I needed the full weight of the federal government. Forging a signature to secure a commercial bank loan across state lines was a textbook case of federal wire fraud. Draining a life insurance trust fund to prop up a failing business was a federal breach of fiduciary duty. If I could secure the original unredacted files from his personal office server, I could bypass the corrupt local police entirely. I could hand a perfectly wrapped, undeniable case file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They would freeze his bank accounts instantly. They would seize his luxury assets, lock him in a federal penitentiary for decades without parole, and secure my daughter's future forever. I sat back down at my computer, cracking my knuckles once more. I began drafting a secure encrypted folder to compile every piece of metadata, every hidden transaction, and every forged signature I had uncovered tonight. I was building a digital forensic guillotine. It was methodical, cold, and precise work. I was going to ruin him so completely that he would never be able to threaten another family again. Suddenly, the harsh, buzzing vibration of my cell phone shattered the quiet focus of the dark room. It rattled against the wooden surface of the desk, the screen illuminating the space with a glaring white light. I glanced at the caller identification. It was a text message from Travis. The digital clock in the corner of my computer screen read 1:15 in the morning. A normal person, a truly innocent family member, would not be sending business propositions past midnight on a Sunday. But predators do not sleep when they are circling their prey. I picked up the phone. The text message was dripping with the exact same condescending artificial warmth he had used to corner me in his expensive kitchen at the barbecue. Thinking about our chat earlier, buddy. I know things have been really hard for you since Chloe passed away. I want to help you out. I can protect your house from the bank and some upcoming tax liabilities if you just sign the property deed over to my LLC temporarily. It keeps the asset perfectly safe in the family trust. Let's talk tomorrow afternoon. I am just looking out for you and Lily. I stared at the glowing words on the small glass screen. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the message was breathtaking. He was actively trying to steal the literal roof over my daughter's head, and he was framing it as an act of profound familial charity. He was laying the deceptive groundwork to steal my home to pay the massive debt he had fraudulently created in my dead wife's name. I did not reply immediately. In any hostage negotiation or counterinsurgency operation, silence is a powerful psychological weapon that forces the other side to reveal their internal anxiety. Let him sweat. Let him wonder if his physical intimidation tactics at the barbecue had actually worked. I placed the phone face down on the wooden desk. I turned back to my glowing monitors and resumed compiling the digital evidence. I needed to move incredibly fast. If Travis was pushing for a deed transfer this aggressively at 1 in the morning, it meant the regional bank was closing in on his Austin project much faster than I had initially calculated. His financial timeline was collapsing, which meant my window to act and protect my daughter was shrinking rapidly. I needed to reach out to an old contact from my Special Forces days, a man who now worked as a senior special agent for the Internal Revenue Service. I needed to get this massive file into federal hands by Wednesday at the absolute latest. But as I organized the final digital folder of financial documents, a deep, unsettling instinct flared aggressively in the back of my mind. It was the exact same visceral physical warning I used to get right before a foot patrol was ambushed in a hostile valley. The hair on my arms stood straight up. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy and difficult to breathe. Travis was arrogant, entitled, and cruel, but he was not stupid. He had to know that pressuring a grieving homeowner to sign over a property deed in the middle of the night was a massive red flag. He would not rely entirely on the physical threat he made in the kitchen to ensure my compliance. He would need leverage. He would need a mechanism to force my hand something so emotionally devastating that I would gladly sign away my house just to make the pain stop. He had threatened to put me in a wheelchair. He had threatened to have his wife Sarah take primary custody of Lily. He had pointedly mentioned that the family courts would never believe a traumatized veteran over a wealthy pillar of the community. My blood ran entirely cold. I was not going to wait patiently for me to agree to the deed transfer. He was going to manufacture an immediate crisis that would break me psychologically, discredit me legally, and put my daughter directly into his control. I was going to strike my absolute weakest point first, forcing me to surrender my financial assets to get her back. I quickly closed all the financial windows on my computer, heavily encrypting the solid-state drive and hiding the access keys deep within a standard corporate compliance folder. I shut down the machine and stood up, my heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I walked silently down the hallway and cracked open the door to Lily's bedroom. She was still fast asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her breathing slow and perfectly even. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her, promising her silently that I would burn the entire world down to the ashes before I let anyone take her away from me. I did not sleep that night. I sat in a chair in the living room in the dark, drinking black coffee, watching the empty street through the closed blinds, waiting for the sun to rise. I knew the attack was coming. I just did not know what form it would take until the heavy, authoritative pounding echoed violently on my front door at exactly 7:30 the next morning. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, casting a pale gray light across the suburban streets of Dallas, when I finally stood up from my living room chair. I had not slept a single minute. The digital clock on the microwave glowed bright green, reading 7:15. My mind was still running through the devastating reality of the forged commercial loan I had uncovered in the middle of the night. Travis had stolen my daughter's future, and now he was actively trying to steal the roof over her head. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a third cup of black coffee. The house was completely silent. Lily was still asleep down the hall. I needed to call a federal lawyer. I needed to contact the Internal Revenue Service. But before I could even reach for my phone on the granite counter, the silence of the morning was shattered by 3 loud, authoritative knocks on my front door. It was not a friendly neighbor stopping by. It was the heavy, rhythmic pounding of law enforcement. Every instinct I had honed during my years in the Special Forces flared to life. My heart rate did not spike. It actually slowed down. I set my coffee mug on the counter with deliberate care. I walked softly to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch was a uniformed local sheriff's deputy, with his hand resting cautiously near his duty belt. Beside him stood a woman in a gray business suit, holding a thick clipboard, looking deeply uncomfortable. I knew exactly what this was before I even turned the deadbolt. Travis had realized his midnight text message would not be enough to force me to hand over the deed to my house. He had escalated the war, striking at the absolute most vulnerable part of my life. I opened the door and offered a calm, polite smile. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you today?" The deputy shifted his weight, his eyes scanning my face, then peering past my shoulder into the living room. "Caleb Sterling." "Yes, sir," I replied, keeping my hands visible and my voice incredibly soft. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Brenda Walsh. I am an investigator with Dallas County Child Protective Services. We received an emergency anonymous report early this morning regarding the welfare of your daughter, Lily. We need to come inside and speak with you immediately." The words hit the air like a physical blow. Child Protective Services. They had actually done it. Travis and his wife, Sarah, had weaponized the state government against me. They had filed a false report to take my daughter. A hot, blinding flash of rage burned in the back of my skull, begging me to yell to demand who called them to act like a furious, protective father. But the analytical side of my brain violently suppressed the anger. That was exactly the trap Travis had laid. If I raised my voice, if I got defensive, if I acted erratic or angry, I would hand them the exact proof they needed. "Please come in," I said, opening the door wide and stepping aside. They walked into my foyer. Brenda looked around nervously, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. The deputy stayed close to the door. "Before we go any further," Brenda said, her voice tight with tension, "the report we received states that you are a military veteran suffering from severe untreated combat trauma. The caller claimed you have been experiencing violent episodes, that the house is in a state of severe neglect, and that you have multiple unsecured illegal firearms lying around where your 6-year-old daughter can reach them. For our safety and hers, we need to ask if you are armed right now." The sheer cruelty of the lies took my breath away. Travis and Sarah had taken my honorable service as a Green Beret medic, the years I spent putting my life on the line to save wounded soldiers in combat zones, and twisted it into a narrative of an unstable, dangerous madman. They were trying to build a paper trail for a custody battle. They wanted to prove I was unfit to parent, so they could take Lily, use her as leverage, and force me to surrender all my financial assets to their failing real estate company. I looked directly into Brenda's eyes, projecting absolute clarity and calm. "I am not armed, Brenda. I am a corporate compliance officer for a logistics firm. I am a veteran, yes, but I do not have untreated trauma, and I have never had a violent episode in my life. You are welcome to search my person, and you are welcome to inspect every single inch of this home. Let me show you around." I led them into the living room. It was spotless. There was no trash, no squalor. The vacuum lines were still visible on the area rug from when I cleaned on Saturday. I guided them into the kitchen, pointing out the fully stocked refrigerator with fresh fruit, vegetables, and milk. There were no dirty dishes in the sink. The home was impeccably organized, a reflection of my military discipline and my deep desire to give Lily a stable, clean environment. Brenda looked genuinely surprised. The tense grip she had on her clipboard began to loosen. The deputy took his hand off his belt, his posture relaxing slightly as he surveyed the quiet, perfectly normal suburban home. "You mentioned firearms," I said, turning to the deputy. "I do hunt occasionally. I have 3 hunting rifles. They are legally registered, and they are stored exactly as the law requires. Please follow me to my home office." I walked them down the hall, my footsteps light. I paused outside Lily's bedroom door, pressing my finger to my lips. "My daughter is still sleeping," I whispered. "Please feel free to look inside, but try not to wake her. She has school in an hour." Brenda gently pushed the door open. The morning light filtered through the pink curtains. Lily was tucked warmly under her quilt, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The room was clean, filled with books and toys stored neatly in bins. It was the undeniable picture of a loved, well-cared-for child. Brenda smiled softly and closed the door without making a sound. I continued down the hall to my office. I walked over to a heavy steel biometric gun safe bolted directly to the concrete foundation through the wall studs. I placed my thumb on the scanner. The heavy bolts clicked and I swung the door open. Inside, 3 unloaded hunting rifles sat in their racks. The ammunition was stored in a separate locked steel box on the top shelf. "As you can see," I said calmly, stepping back, so the deputy could inspect the safe. "The weapons are entirely secure. Only my biometric print can open this door. My daughter does not even know this safe exists." The deputy nodded, looking thoroughly impressed. "That is textbook secure storage, Mr. Sterling. Thank you for showing us." I closed the safe, the heavy steel locking with a solid thud. Then I walked over to my desk and opened my bottom drawer. Because of my profession in corporate compliance, I am naturally meticulous with paperwork. I pulled out a thick blue 3-ring binder and handed it to Brenda. "That is Lily's complete medical and academic history," I explained, keeping my voice gentle and helpful. "It contains records of every pediatric visit, all her vaccination charts, her dental cleanings, and her report cards from kindergarten and 1st grade. You will also find letters of recommendation from her teachers and our church pastor. I want to make sure you have everything you need to close this investigation with complete confidence." Brenda opened the binder. She flipped through the meticulously tabbed pages. She saw the perfect attendance records. She saw the glowing notes from Lily's pediatrician, noting her excellent health and development. She saw the truth. She closed the binder and handed it back to me. She looked exhausted, and a flash of genuine anger crossed her face. The anger was not directed at me. It was directed at the person who had wasted her time and resources on a malicious, fabricated lie while real children in the county were actually in danger. "Mr. Sterling," Brenda said with a heavy sigh, "I want to sincerely apologize for this intrusion. Unfortunately, when an anonymous caller makes specific claims about unsecured weapons and combat trauma, the law requires us to respond immediately with law enforcement present. It is abundantly clear to me and the deputy that the report was completely unfounded. You have a beautiful, safe home, and your daughter is clearly thriving. We will be closing this case immediately as a false report." "Thank you, Brenda," I said, walking them back toward the front door. "I know you are just doing your job, and I appreciate how respectfully you handled it." The deputy paused on the porch, offering a firm handshake. "Sorry to wake you up like this, Caleb. You keep doing a good job with that little girl. Thank you for your service." I watched them walk down the driveway and get into their respective vehicles. I stood on the porch in the cool morning air until their taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did I close the heavy wooden door and lock the deadbolt. I leaned my back against the door, closed my eyes, and took a long, ragged breath. My hands, which had been perfectly steady while the authorities were in my home, suddenly began to shake with a violent, uncontainable fury. Travis and Sarah had tried to take my daughter. They had coldly and maliciously weaponized the child welfare system to destroy my family. They had tried to paint me as a broken, dangerous man. If I had been caught off guard, if I had lost my temper and shouted at the CPS worker, if I had refused to let them in out of stubborn pride, they could have taken Lily away from me this morning. They could have placed my 6-year-old daughter in emergency foster care just to force me into submission over a fraudulent real estate debt. The sheer depraved evil of their strategy was breathtaking. They were not just greedy. They were entirely devoid of human empathy. They were predators hiding behind expensive clothes and country club memberships. My cell phone buzzed loudly from the kitchen counter, cutting through the silence of the house. I walked over and looked at the screen. It was Sarah, my sister-in-law, the woman who had undoubtedly made the anonymous phone call less than 2 hours ago. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to sound tired and completely defeated. "Hello, Caleb." "Oh my goodness, are you okay?" Sarah's voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with artificial sugary concern. "Travis and I were just so worried about you this morning. We heard sirens in your neighborhood on the police scanner app. Travis said he thought he saw a CPS car heading your way. Is everything all right over there?" The psychological manipulation was staggering. She was calling to check on the success of her ambush. She wanted to hear panic in my voice. She wanted to hear that I was broken. I gripped the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned white, but my voice remained a masterclass in quiet despair. It was CPS Sarah. They came with a sheriff's deputy. They searched the house. "Oh, Caleb, that is just terrible," Sarah gasped, her tone feigning absolute shock. "I cannot believe someone would do that to you. You know, grief can really take a toll on a person. We have been so worried about your mental health lately. Maybe things are just getting to be too much for you to handle on your own." I closed my eyes, letting her dig her own grave with her words. "I do not know what to do, Sarah. I am just so tired." "Listen to me, Caleb," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, soothing whisper. "Travis and I are your family. We are here to help you. Why do you not pack a bag for Lily? I can come pick her up this afternoon. She can stay with us for the weekend, maybe even next week. You need time to rest, Caleb. You need to get your head straight. Just let us take care of her while you and Travis work out that little paperwork issue with the house deed. It will be so much easier for you if you do not have to worry about parenting right now." There it was. The ultimate extortion. hand over the physical custody of my daughter to them voluntarily sign away the deed to my house to cover their fraudulent debts, and in exchange the anonymous CPS reports would miraculously stop. They were offering to save me from the nightmare they had actively created. I opened my eyes. The mild-mannered, grieving accountant was dead. The man standing in the kitchen was a Tier 1 operator who had just been given a clear target. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, injecting just enough hesitation into my voice to make her believe she was winning. "I really appreciate you offering to take Lily. Let me think about it today. I need to figure some things out. I will call Travis later." "Take all the time you need, sweetie," Sarah cooed triumphantly. "We just want what is best for Lily. We are always here for you." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. I realized in that exact moment that simply defending myself was no longer an option. Securing my assets and reporting the forged loan to the bank would not stop them. If I just froze their accounts, they would continue to attack my character. They would file more false reports. They would drag me through a brutal, agonizing family court battle using their wealth and their standing in the church community to paint me as an unstable veteran. They would never stop trying to take Lily. There could be no half measures. There could be no polite legal settlements. I had to utterly and completely dismantle their entire existence. I had to rip away their money, their social status, their freedom, and their pristine public masks. I had to expose them to the harsh light of federal law in a way that left them with absolutely nothing. I walked down the hallway and opened Lily's door again. She was starting to stir, stretching her little arms above her head and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Good morning, Daddy," she mumbled, offering a sleepy smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, kneeling beside her bed and brushing the hair out of her face. "I am going to make some pancakes for breakfast. And then Daddy has some very important work to do today." I was going to build a federal trap so inescapable that Travis and Sarah would not even realize the jaws had snapped shut until they were already in handcuffs. The defensive line was abandoned. It was time to go on the offensive. When the Child Protective Services worker walked down my driveway and drove away, a profound silence fell over my house. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a near miss in a combat zone. Travis and his wife, Sarah, had just tried to use the state government to take my 6-year-old daughter away from me. They had filed a fabricated report accusing me of being a dangerous, unstable veteran. They wanted to strip away my custody so they could use Lily as leverage to force me into signing over the deed to my home. I stood in my kitchen, gripping the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned completely white. For 2 years, I had played the role of the quiet, grieving accountant. I had swallowed their insults, tolerated their condescension, and kept my head down to give my daughter a normal life. But defending myself was no longer an option. If you spend your entire life building walls to keep predators out, they will simply starve you into submission. The only way to stop a predator is to burn their hunting grounds to ash. I was not going to wait for Travis to file another false report. I was not going to wait for a corrupt local family court judge to question my mental stability. I was going to completely dismantle my brother-in-law. I needed allies. I could not go to the local police department. Travis was deeply embedded in the local political machine. He donated to the re-election campaigns of the mayor and the sheriff. He played golf at the country club with the precinct captains. If I handed my digital evidence to a local detective, Travis would be notified before I even left the parking lot. His expensive corporate lawyers would bury the investigation in procedural delays, giving him ample time to destroy the original forged documents and move his stolen money offshore. To take down a man with that much local influence, I needed federal weight. I needed an overwhelming force that would shatter his empire instantly and permanently. I packed my heavily encrypted laptop into a leather briefcase, kissed my sleeping daughter on the forehead, and left her in the care of a trusted neighborhood babysitter. I got into my car and drove across town to an exclusive gated community where the houses were set far back from the street behind towering oak trees. I pulled into a wide circular driveway and parked in front of a massive brick estate. This was the home of Robert Harrison. Robert was 68 years old, a retired federal judge with a reputation for absolute terrifying integrity. He was also a prominent elder at the massive 5,000-member church that Travis and Sarah attended. Robert had known my late wife since she was a child, and he had always treated me with a quiet, respectful dignity that the rest of her family completely lacked. Robert opened the front door himself. He was wearing a simple cardigan and reading glasses, but his posture still carried the undeniable authority of a man who had spent 4 decades sentencing organized crime bosses to federal prison. He took one look at my face and stepped aside to let me in. We walked in silence to his private study. It was a room that smelled of old paper and leather-lined floor-to-ceiling with legal volumes. Before Robert could even ask why I was there, the heavy brass knocker on his front door echoed through the house. Robert looked at me with a question in his eyes. I told him I had invited one more person. A few moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered man walked into the study. His name was Elias. Elias and I had served together in the United States Army Special Forces. We had survived firefights in narrow mountain passes and pulled each other out of burning vehicles. We knew exactly how the other person thought under extreme pressure. Today, Elias was not wearing tactical gear. He wore a sharply tailored suit and carried a gold federal badge in his breast pocket. I was a senior special agent for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Most people think the IRS only deals with tax audits, but the criminal division is entirely different. They are the federal agents who carry firearms and take down international cartels' massive financial fraud rings and corrupt politicians. They have the power to freeze a billionaire's bank accounts with a single phone call. The 3 of us sat around Robert's massive mahogany desk. The air in the room was thick with tension. I opened my briefcase powered on my laptop and entered the decryption keys. I turned the glowing screen toward the retired judge and the federal agent. I started from the beginning. I showed them the life insurance trust fund that my wife had left for Lily meant to guarantee her college education. I showed them the heavily redacted quarterly reports Travis had been sending me. Then I bypassed his digital blackout boxes and revealed the raw financial data underneath. I showed them that Travis had completely drained the $300,000 6 months ago, replacing the cash with worthless promissory notes from his own failing real estate company. Robert let out a slow, heavy breath, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Elias remained perfectly still, his eyes scanning the numbers with the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned investigator. But I was not finished. I opened the second folder. I brought up the commercial loan documents for the half-finished real estate development Travis was building down in Austin. I zoomed in on the guarantor signature line at the bottom of the final page. I watched Robert lean forward, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he recognized my late wife's forged signature. I explained how Travis had used his dying sister-in-law's identity to fraudulently secure $500,000 in commercial debt, tying the liability directly to my home. "This is federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft," Elias said quietly, his voice hard as steel. "He is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence just for forging the signature across state banking lines." I nodded, but I told them there was a missing piece to this puzzle. A man like Travis, a man obsessed with appearances and social status, does not steal from his own 6-year-old niece unless he is backed into a terrifying financial corner. I had spent the previous night pulling every public record tied to his entire corporate portfolio. I opened my final master spreadsheet and projected it onto the large monitor mounted on the wall of the study. I had traced the flow of money through dozens of shell companies and limited liability corporations managed by Travis. I had mapped out every inbound investment and every outbound payment for the past 3 years. Robert stood up from his leather chair and walked slowly toward the glowing screen. He stared at the list of private investors who had been pouring cash into Travis's real estate funds. As the retired judge read the names aloud, his voice began to shake with a profound, sickening realization. Martha Higgins, Claire Miller, Beatrice Sterling, Evelyn Vance. These were not wealthy venture capitalists. These were not corporate hedge funds. These were elderly women from our church. They were widows in their 70s and 80s. I watched the blood completely drain from Robert's face. He knew these women. He had served communion to them. He had attended their husbands' funerals. Travis was not just a failing businessman trying to cover a few bad debts. He was operating a massive, devastating affinity fraud scheme. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme wrapped in the pristine, untouchable cloak of religious devotion. Travis used his status as a wealthy, charismatic pillar of the megachurch to target the most vulnerable members of the congregation. He would approach grieving widows, pray with them, offer them comfort, and then convince them to mortgage their paid-off homes to invest in his guaranteed real estate funds. But the forensic data on the screen proved that the money never went to any construction projects. Travis was taking the life savings of these elderly women and using it to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was paying for his custom-tailored suits, his luxury cars, his country club memberships, and his sprawling mansion. He was using the money from new victims to pay small fake dividends to the early investors, keeping the illusion of profitability alive. When the well of new victims began to run dry, his entire fraudulent empire started to collapse. That was why he had grown desperate enough to drain Lily's trust fund. That was why he had forged my dead wife's signature. I was cannibalizing his own family to keep his criminal enterprise afloat just a little bit longer. The silence in the study was absolute. The revelation shifted the entire gravity of the room. This was no longer just a personal fight to save my daughter and protect my home. This was a rescue mission for dozens of innocent elderly women whose entire lives were about to be financially destroyed by a predator they trusted with their souls. Robert turned away from the screen and placed his hands flat on the mahogany desk. His eyes were burning with a righteous, contained fury. He looked at Elias. "How fast can you move on this?" Elias unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat back in his chair, his expression deeply serious. "I can get a federal task force assembled by tomorrow morning," Elias said. "We have enough digital evidence right here to open a massive federal probe. But an investigation takes time. We have to subpoena bank records, secure search warrants, and conduct interviews. If Travis catches even a whisper that the IRS and the FBI are looking into his books, he will panic." Elias laid out the brutal reality of white-collar crime. Travis was cornered and cornered animals run. If we started a standard investigation, Travis would immediately sense the pressure. He would wire the remaining stolen millions to untraceable offshore accounts. He would shred the physical documents, wipe his corporate servers, post a massive cash bail, and board a private flight out of the country before we could secure a travel ban. He would disappear to a non-extradition country, leaving me with a foreclosed home, my daughter with a stolen future, and the widows of the church entirely bankrupt. "We cannot just investigate him," I said, looking between my two allies. "We have to trap him. We have to lock the doors before he even realizes he is inside the cage." Robert nodded slowly. "You need an immediate ex parte federal asset freeze. You need a federal magistrate to lock down every single bank account, property deed, and corporate asset Travis owns without giving him prior notice or a hearing." "Exactly," Elias agreed. "But federal judges do not grant instant secret asset freezes based solely on digital spreadsheets scraped from public databases and unverified server logs. The burden of proof for an immediate freeze is incredibly high. We have to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that a severe federal crime is actively occurring and that the suspect is an immediate flight risk." Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "To get that order signed tonight, and to justify a no-bail arrest warrant, I need the smoking gun. I need the original forged commercial loan document, the one with your wife's signature in blue ink. Digital copies can be dismissed by his lawyers as computer errors or manipulated files. But if I have the physical forged document, his entire defense crumbles instantly." Robert looked at me. "Where is the original document?" "It is in his possession," I answered. "He has to present it to the regional bank next week to finalize the restructuring of his debt." "Then we have a massive problem," Robert said, pacing the length of the study. "You cannot break into his office and steal it. If the evidence is obtained illegally, it becomes inadmissible in federal court. His lawyers will have it thrown out, the asset freeze will be lifted, and he will escape." I looked at the retired judge and the federal agent. The tactical training from my military past kicked in, overriding the anxiety of the civilian world. In special forces, when a target is heavily fortified and you cannot breach their defenses without alerting them, you do not attack the walls. You offer them something they want so badly that they open the gates and walk outside voluntarily. "We do not have to steal the document," I said quietly. "We are going to make Travis hand it to us himself." Elias raised an eyebrow. Why would a man running a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme voluntarily hand a forged federal document to anyone? "Because he is arrogant," I replied. "He believes he is the smartest man in any room. He believes his money and his status make him untouchable. And more importantly, he believes I am a weak, broken coward who is terrified of losing custody of my daughter." I laid out the strategy. Travis was actively trying to steal the physical deed to my house to cover his collapsing debts. He had sent Child Protective Services to my door this morning to break my spirit and establish a paper trail that I was an unfit father. He wanted me to voluntarily sign over my property out of sheer terror. We were going to give him exactly what he wanted. I would contact Travis and pretend that the visit from the authorities had completely broken me. I would play the role of the desperate, traumatized widower begging for mercy. I would tell him that I was ready to surrender my house, ready to sign whatever he needed as long as he called off his legal hounds and let me keep Lily. But I knew Travis's ego. He would not just want me to sign a paper in a quiet coffee shop. He was a narcissist who thrived on dominance and public validation. He would want to humiliate me completely. He would insist that I bring the signed property deed to him, directly, likely accompanied by his own sleazy corporate lawyers, to ensure the transfer was legally binding and to force me to acknowledge his absolute victory. "I am going to offer him the deed to my house," I told Robert and Elias. "I am going to insist that we exchange documents. I will give him my house, but in return he has to physically bring the original loan paperwork showing my wife's signature under the guise that I need to see the debt cleared before I hand over my property. His greed and his desperate need for my house will blind him to the risk. He will bring the original forged documents right to me." Elias smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "And when he hands you that forged document to prove the debt, he will be committing federal wire fraud and uttering a forged instrument right in front of us. That is the smoking gun." Robert walked back behind his mahogany desk. "If you can get him to present that physical document in a controlled environment, I can take this entire file to a federal magistrate I know very well. We can secure the asset freeze order and the arrest warrants tonight under seal. They will be ready to execute the second he hands you the paper." The trap was beautifully simple and incredibly dangerous. I had to convince a sociopath that I was entirely defeated. I had to walk into a room with a man who wanted to destroy my life, look him in the eye, and play the victim perfectly. If my mask slipped for a single second, if he suspected I was wearing a wire or working with federal agents, he would burn the evidence and run. But as I looked at the names of the elderly widows on the screen, and as I thought about my 6-year-old daughter sleeping safely in her bed, I knew I would not fail. Travis wanted to play a game of power and intimidation. He was about to learn what happens when you invite a predator into your home and mistake him for prey. I closed my laptop and told Elias to assemble his team. It was time to go hunting. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and prepared for the most important performance of my life. In the military, we call it operational camouflage. You do not simply put on a disguise to blend into an environment. You have to completely dissolve your own identity and become exactly what the enemy expects to see. Travis expected to see a broken man. He expected to see a terrified, grieving widower who had been completely crushed by the weight of a Child Protective Services investigation. He expected a coward who was ready to surrender his home just to make the nightmare stop. I went into the back of my closet and pulled out a faded, wrinkled flannel shirt and a pair of jeans that were slightly too baggy. I had purposely slept for only 2 hours the night before, pacing my living room in the dark, allowing heavy bruised bags to form under my eyes. I did not shave the rough stubble on my jaw. I drank 4 cups of strong black coffee on a completely empty stomach, ensuring my hands would have a natural, visible tremor that I could not control even if I tried. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a former Tier 1 operator, who knew how to dismantle a threat in seconds. I saw a defeated, exhausted single father who was on the verge of a total psychological and emotional collapse. It was the perfect bait. I sent Travis a brief text message asking if we could meet to talk. I chose a high-end artisanal coffee shop in the wealthiest commercial district of downtown Dallas. It was exactly the kind of location where a man like Travis would feel most powerful. The cafe featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows, imported white marble tables, and a parking lot filled with expensive European sports cars. I arrived 30 minutes early and deliberately chose a small table right in the center of the room where everyone could see us. I sat hunched over my cooling coffee, shrinking my posture, staring blankly at the table and bouncing my leg nervously. I waited with the cold, calculated patience of a sniper in a blind. Exactly 15 minutes late, Travis arrived. I watched through the glass windows as he pulled his slate-gray Porsche directly into the loading zone, tossing his keys to the valet with a wave of arrogant familiarity. He walked through the heavy glass front doors like he owned the entire city block. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit with a silk pocket square that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. His hair was perfectly styled and his teeth flashed artificially white as he greeted the barista by name. He spotted me immediately. As he walked toward my table, I forced my shoulders to slump even further and cast my eyes down toward my shaking hands. Travis did not sit down right away. He stood over my table for a long, agonizing moment, forcing me to physically look up at him. It is a classic cheap intimidation tactic used by corporate bullies who read too many airport paperbacks on power dynamics. When he finally took the seat across from me, he did not order a drink. He just leaned back, crossed his legs, and smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. He let his eyes wander over my wrinkled shirt, my unshaven face, and my trembling fingers. I was soaking in my misery like a sponge, entirely convinced that his ruthless tactics had worked flawlessly. I took a shaky breath, forcing my vocal cords to tighten so my voice would crack just a little bit when I spoke. "Thank you for meeting me, Travis," I said, keeping my volume low and entirely submissive. I did not know who else to call. Travis let out a soft, patronizing chuckle that made my blood run cold. He leaned forward and rested his heavy forearms on the marble table, invading my personal space. "I figured you would be calling soon, Caleb," he said smoothly. "Word travels fast in our community. I heard you had a little trouble with the state authorities yesterday morning. Something about child welfare investigating your home. That must have been completely terrifying for a fragile guy like you." I closed my eyes and let out a long, ragged breath, playing the role of a man who was completely out of options and running on fumes. "They searched my entire house, Travis. They went through Lily's bedroom. They opened her closet. They asked me all these invasive questions about my military service and my mental health." I opened my eyes and looked at him with fabricated desperation. "I cannot lose her, Travis. She is absolutely all I have left of Chloe. If they take her away from me and put her in the system, I will not survive it." Travis nodded slowly, feigning a look of deep pastoral sympathy, but his eyes were bright with unadulterated triumph. He was absolutely loving this dynamic. I leaned across the table, maintaining the act, letting the pure panic bleed into my voice. "You win, Travis. I surrender completely. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the house over to your real estate company today. I will not ask any more questions about the life insurance trust fund money. You can have all of it. Just please call them off. Tell Sarah to drop the anonymous reports and the custody threats. Let me keep my daughter. I will sign the property deed right now if you just promise to leave us alone." Travis stared at me for a long, heavy time. I could see the gears turning behind his expensive designer sunglasses. He had won the war. He had completely broken the stubborn, annoying brother-in-law who had dared to stand up to him at the Sunday barbecue. He had secured the physical deed to a house he desperately needed to cover his massive fraudulent commercial debts, and he had done it without spending a single dollar on legal fees. But Travis was a textbook narcissist, and narcissists are never satisfied with a quiet, private victory. They require an audience. They require absolute public submission to feed their fragile egos. He leaned back in his leather chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket, and let out a long theatrical sigh. "Caleb, buddy." He started, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. "This is how the real world works. You have been living in this little suburban bubble, playing the tragic noble widower, expecting everyone to just feel sorry for you forever. But the real world is about power. It is about leverage and knowing your place. You tried to stand in the way of family business, and you found out exactly what happens when you play out of your league with men who actually build things. I am glad you finally came to your senses and realized you are not equipped for this level of stress." I kept my head bowed, staring at the marble tabletop. "I know, Travis. I am sorry I questioned you. I just want to sign the transfer papers and be done with it. Can we please do it today and get this over with?" Travis shook his head slowly, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. "No, Caleb, we are not doing it today. And we are certainly not doing it in some random coffee shop where no one can see it happen. You see, you disrespected me in my own home on Sunday. You'd made me look bad in front of my wife and my guests. You need to learn a permanent lesson about respect and hierarchy in this family. I am being honored this Saturday night at the church spring charity gala. They are giving me the Community Leader of the Year award for my philanthropic work. All the major commercial investors will be there. The local politicians will be there. Our entire family and congregation will be there." I looked up at him, widening my eyes and letting my breathing turn shallow in fake panic. "Travis, please do not make me go to a gala. I do not belong in a place like that. I do not even own a tuxedo. I cannot handle crowds right now with everything going on." "That is exactly why you are going to go," Travis interrupted, his voice hardening into a direct command. "You are going to put on a cheap suit. You are going to show up to the country club on Saturday night, and you are going to bring the original property deed with your signature on it. You are going to hand it directly to me and my corporate lawyer in the executive boardroom right before I walk out on that stage to accept my award." I let my hands shake visibly as I gripped my coffee cup, forcing the porcelain to rattle slightly against the saucer. "And what about the bank loan, Travis? The commercial debt with Chloe's name on it? If I give you my house, how do I know you will actually clear the debt and protect me from foreclosure?" Travis rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed that a peasant like me was even asking about the logistics of his complex financial fraud. "Do not worry your fragile little mind about the regional bank, Caleb. My lawyer will have the original loan guarantee paperwork with Chloe's signature right there in the boardroom with us. We will do a direct physical exchange. You hand me the deed to your house, and I will hand you the original commercial loan document to prove the debt is being restructured under my company. The liability will be transferred away from you, and you walk away perfectly clean. You get to go back to your pathetic, quiet little life with Lily, and I get to save the family investments from your incompetence. Everyone wins." I stared at him, pretending to heavily weigh the options, pretending to be utterly terrified of the public humiliation he was planning for me. But inside my mind, a cold, predatory calm settled over my racing thoughts. He had just offered me exactly what I needed to destroy him. In order to secure a federal asset freeze and a no-bail arrest warrant, the IRS and the FBI needed the smoking gun. Digital copies of forged documents could be contested in court by high-priced defense attorneys. They could claim the files were manipulated or hacked. But Travis, in his boundless arrogance and desperate need to humiliate me, was going to physically bring the original forged federal document to a specific location. He was going to hand the evidence directly to me in a controlled environment with his own lawyer present. He was walking directly into the absolute center of a federal kill zone, and his ego had made him completely blind to the crosshairs resting on his chest. "Okay," I whispered, letting my voice crack one final time, looking down in total defeat. "I will be there on Saturday night. I will bring the deed to the house. Please just promise you will call off the Child Protective Services agents." Travis stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a satisfied, triumphant flourish. He reached into his pocket and tossed a crisp $20 bill onto the marble table to cover my black coffee, a final petty insult designed to assert his absolute dominance over my financial situation. "Good boy, Caleb. I knew you would eventually figure out what is best for your daughter. See you Saturday night. Do not do anything stupid between now and then, or the authorities will be back at your house to take Lily before you can even blink." He turned his back on me and walked out of the coffee shop, the bell above the glass door chiming merrily as he left. I sat at the table for exactly 3 minutes, watching through the glass as the valet brought his Porsche around. I watched him pull out of the parking lot and merge into the heavy downtown traffic. I watched until the expensive car completely disappeared from sight. Then I stopped bouncing my leg. My hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably for the past half hour, suddenly became completely still. I sat up straight, rolling my shoulders back, feeling the familiar, rigid posture of a soldier returning to my spine. The terrified, broken accountant evaporated into the air-conditioned breeze of the coffee shop, leaving only the tactical operator behind. I picked up the $20 bill he had thrown at me, folded it neatly, and placed it under my coffee cup as a tip for the hard-working waitress. I stood up and walked out into the bright, warm Texas sun. My fake tears were gone. My feigned fear had vanished entirely. The bait had been taken, and the trap was firmly set. Travis thought he was going to a lavish country club gala to humiliate me and steal my family home. He had absolutely no idea that he had just meticulously planned the exact time and location of his own federal arrest. The heavy Texas humidity clung to the evening air as I handed the keys of my modest sedan to the valet at the front entrance of the Oak Creek Country Club. The valet was a young kid, maybe 19, and he looked momentarily confused as he glanced from my thoroughly unremarkable car to the man stepping out of it. For the past 2 years, I had deliberately dressed like a man who wanted to disappear. I had worn ill-fitting slacks, slightly rumpled shirts, and shoes that had seen better days. I had cultivated the posture of a grieving, overwhelmed widower who was slowly being crushed by the weight of suburban life. But tonight, that man was gone. I stepped onto the illuminated cobblestone walkway, wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo. It was a garment I had commissioned years ago during my time in the Special Forces for high-level diplomatic security galas in European capitals, a lifetime before I became a corporate compliance officer. The fabric was pristine, the cut exacting, and it fit my shoulders with absolute unforgiving precision. When you wear armor that is forged perfectly to your frame, it changes the way you move. The deliberate slouch I had practiced for 2 years vanished. My spine straightened, my shoulders pulled back. The heavy measured footfalls of a Tier 1 operator returned to my stride. I was no longer hiding, and the quiet, predatory confidence that had kept me alive in hostile territories settled deep into my bones. I walked through the massive double doors of the country club and into the grand foyer. The air conditioning was crisp, biting against my skin, carrying the scent of expensive floral arrangements and roasted meats. The annual Spring Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the local megachurch social calendar, a glittering monument to wealthy congregants, celebrating their own supposed generosity. The grand ballroom stretched out before me, a sea of silk dresses, tailored suits, and crystal chandeliers, casting prismatic light across the polished dance floor. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to what was in reality a room full of financial victims mingling with their predator. I paused at the top of the carpeted stairs leading down to the main floor. The military training kicked in automatically. I did not look at the decorations or the flashing cameras of the local society photographers. I scanned the room, tactically assessing exits, identifying sightlines, and mapping the human terrain. I saw the mayor shaking hands near the open bar. I saw local real estate tycoons laughing loudly over high-end bourbon. But more importantly, I saw the elderly members of our church congregation. I saw women in their 70s and 80s, women who had trusted Travis with their life savings, dressed in their finest jewelry, smiling and clapping as they were guided to their tables. They thought they were attending a celebration of faith and community. They had no idea their retirement funds had already been drained to pay for the very crystal glasses they were holding. A cold, absolute fury settled in my chest, locking my focus onto the singular mission of the night. I descended the stairs and merged into the crowd. The reaction was almost immediate. I had spent years being invisible, the pathetic brother-in-law that people offered sympathetic, pitying smiles to before quickly walking away. Tonight, conversations paused as I passed. People who had known me for 2 years stared, trying to reconcile the sharp, commanding presence of the man in the tuxedo with the broken accountant they thought they knew. I did not smile to put them at ease. I did not nod or offer polite suburban greetings. I moved through the room with the direct, unyielding purpose of a hunter tracking a scent. It took exactly 4 minutes for Sarah to spot me. She was standing near an ice sculpture at the center of the room, holding a flute of champagne and holding court with a circle of wealthy country club wives. She was wearing a stunning floor-length crimson gown that undoubtedly cost thousands of dollars of stolen money. When her eyes locked onto mine, the practiced, perfect smile on her face faltered. Her eyes widened, scanning me from the polished tips of my shoes to the rigid military set of my jaw. She had expected me to arrive in a cheap, wrinkled suit. She had expected me to look terrified, broken by the visit from Child Protective Services, desperate to hand over the deed to my house just to keep my daughter safe. The man standing before her did not look like a victim. He looked like an executioner. She whispered something to the women around her, set her champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp clink, and began marching toward me. I stopped walking, letting her close the distance. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely behind my back in a parade rest posture, waiting for the attack. Caleb, Sarah, said, her voice a strained, breathless whisper as she pulled up short just inches from my chest. "What on earth are you wearing?" "Good evening, Sarah," I replied, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. "You look lovely tonight." She blinked, completely thrown off balance by my calm demeanor. She glanced around nervously, checking to see if anyone was watching us. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice into that familiar, cloying tone of artificial concern. She was trying to regain the upper hand, trying to reestablish the psychological dominance she thought she had secured by sending state authorities to my home. "I am so surprised you actually came," she murmured, her eyes darting over my face, searching for a twitch, a sign of fear, a crack in the armor. "After everything that happened yesterday morning with the authorities visiting your home, Travis and I were certain you would be completely overwhelmed. We thought you might be having another one of your episodes. Are you sure you are in the right mental state to be out in public, Caleb? We just worry about you so much." She was probing for weakness. She wanted me to stammer, to look down, to beg her quietly to call off the dogs. I looked directly into her eyes. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I let a long, uncomfortable silence stretch between us, forcing her to endure the heavy, suffocating pressure of my unbroken stare. "My mental state has never been clearer, Sarah," I said quietly. I spoke with a chilling, deliberate politeness, the kind of absolute calm that only comes from knowing you hold the winning hand in a game the other person does not even realize they are playing. "I appreciate your deep concern for my family, but you will find that I am remarkably capable of handling whatever uninvited guests show up at my front door." The blood slowly drained from her face. The passive-aggressive pity vanished, replaced by a sudden, genuine spike of anxiety. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. She realized in that exact moment that the psychological warfare tactics she had used to terrorize other people her entire life had absolutely no effect on me. I was a blank wall, and her threats were bouncing off harmlessly. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching the fabric of her expensive crimson gown. Before she could muster another lie, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my right shoulder. "Look who finally decided to show up and play dress-up," Travis sneered. I did not flinch at his touch, though the grip was aggressive and meant to physically dominate. I turned my head slowly to face my brother-in-law. Travis was wearing a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket, his hair perfectly coiffed, his skin glowing with an expensive artificial tan. He looked like the king of the world, a man entirely intoxicated by his own perceived power. He had just been nominated for the Community Leader of the Year award, and he was surrounded by hundreds of people who believed he was a financial genius. His ego was so massive, so blindingly bright, that he could not see the danger standing right in front of him. Unlike Sarah, Travis did not notice the change in my posture. He did not recognize that the tuxedo was not just a costume, but a return to form. He saw only what his narcissism allowed him to see. A desperate man who had finally shown up to surrender his most valuable asset. "I told you to bring the paperwork," Caleb Travis said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening growl that was completely at odds with the wide, charismatic smile he was plastering on his face for the benefit of the surrounding guests. "Tell me you did not come here empty-handed after the warning we gave you yesterday." I reached inside the breast pocket of my tuxedo jacket and let my fingers graze the thick red tabbed folder resting against my ribs. The folder did not contain the deed to my house. It contained the meticulously compiled forensic evidence of his massive Ponzi scheme, the proof of the life insurance trust he had drained from my daughter, and a signed federal asset freeze order from a United States magistrate judge. "I brought exactly what you asked for, Travis," I said smoothly. "Everything is signed and ready for your review." A flash of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over his face. He believed he had won. He believed that sending Child Protective Services to terrorize my daughter had broken my spirit, completely forcing me to hand over the physical deed to my home, to cover his fraudulent, collapsing commercial debts. He squeezed my shoulder harder, digging his fingers into the muscle, a physical reminder of the threat he had made in the kitchen less than a week ago. "Good boy," Travis whispered, the cruelty in his voice unmistakable. He released my shoulder and grabbed me firmly by the bicep, steering me away from Sarah and pulling me through the dense crowd of gala attendees. I let him lead me. I offered absolutely no physical resistance, moving with him smoothly through the sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits. We walked past the long banquet tables covered in white silk, past the ice sculptures melting slowly in the ambient heat of the room, and past the dozens of elderly investors who smiled and waved at Travis as he walked by. He nodded to them, playing the gracious host, all while gripping my arm like a prison guard, escorting an inmate to the execution chamber. We moved toward the grand staircase at the far end of the ballroom. At the top of the stairs, suspended over the main floor like a glass cage, was the executive boardroom. It was a space designed entirely for intimidation. The walls were made of heavy soundproof glass, allowing whoever was inside to look down upon the entire gala while remaining completely insulated from the noise of the crowd. It was the perfect stage for a narcissist who wanted to feel like a god observing his subjects. It was also the exact location I needed him to be in. A contained, isolated environment where the federal trap could snap shut without triggering a massive public panic until the handcuffs were already secured. Travis marched me up the carpeted steps, his grip never loosening. I could feel the adrenaline beginning to hum low and steady in my veins, the familiar chemical rush that precedes a breach. My breathing remained deep and even. We reached the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. Travis pushed them open and shoved me roughly inside, stepping in behind me and letting the doors click shut. The ambient noise of the gala below vanished, instantly replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of the soundproof room. A massive mahogany conference table dominated the space. Sitting at the far end of the table, looking bored and morally bankrupt, was Travis's high-priced corporate defense attorney, a man with slicked-back hair and a briefcase resting open on the polished wood. Travis walked past me, straightening his velvet jacket and taking his place at the head of the table. He stood directly in front of the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, the glittering ballroom sprawling out beneath him. He looked down at the crowd, took a deep breath, and turned back to face me with a smile that was entirely devoid of human empathy. He rested his hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward, relishing the absolute power he believed he held over my life, my home, and my daughter's future. "Time to sign, hero," Travis sneered. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom clicked shut, severing us completely from the swelling orchestral music and the clinking champagne glasses of the charity gala below. The sudden suffocating silence of the soundproof room was deliberate. This space was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, designed by men who wanted to feel like gods looking down from Mount Olympus. The exterior wall was constructed entirely of thick floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the grand ballroom directly beneath us. Through that glass, I could see the hundreds of wealthy church members, local politicians, and elderly congregants mingling in their formal wear, completely unaware of the financial slaughter taking place above their heads. Travis walked past me with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won the war. He straightened the lapels of his velvet tuxedo jacket and took his place at the head of a massive polished mahogany conference table. The table was easily 20 feet long, an absurd piece of furniture meant to distance the powerful from the powerless. Sitting halfway down the right side of the table was a man I had never met, but whose type I recognized instantly. He was a high-priced corporate defense attorney. He wore a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit, a silk tie perfectly knotted, and a gold Rolex that caught the recessed lighting. His hair was slicked back, and his face held the bored, morally bankrupt expression of someone who billed $800 an hour to legally sanitize extortion. Travis gestured grandly toward a leather chair on the opposite side of the table. "Have a seat, Caleb," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I remained standing. The military training ingrained in my bones dictated that you never surrender your mobility in a hostile environment unless absolutely necessary. I kept my posture relaxed, but grounded my hands resting loosely at my sides. "Suit yourself," Travis sneered, dropping into his own chair and leaning back with an expansive, arrogant sigh. "Caleb, this is my legal counsel, Richard Belmont. Richard, this is my brother-in-law, the one I told you about. The one who has been struggling so much lately with his mental health and his financial obligations." Richard Belmont did not offer to shake my hand. He merely offered a tight professional smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. Travis has explained the unfortunate situation regarding your property and the impending bank foreclosure. We are here to offer you a seamless private resolution that will protect your family from public embarrassment and financial ruin." Belmont reached into his Italian leather briefcase and produced a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He squared the edges precisely and slid the stack across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table. The papers stopped just inches from my fingertips. Resting on top of the stack was a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. "That is a standard quitclaim deed and a transfer of ownership agreement." Belmont explained, his tone smooth and entirely devoid of human empathy. "By signing those documents, you are voluntarily transferring the deed of your primary residence to Travis's Limited Liability Corporation. In exchange, Travis's company will assume the burden of the $500,000 commercial debt currently tied to the property. You will walk away with nothing, but you will also walk away free of the massive liability that is currently dragging you into bankruptcy. It is an incredibly generous offer given your circumstances." I looked down at the documents. It was a masterclass in legal deception. They were framing the theft of my home as an act of familial charity. They were pretending to save me from a debt that Travis himself had fraudulently created by forging my dead wife's signature while she lay dying in a hospital bed. The sheer, unadulterated evil of the arrangement was breathtaking. Travis leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and clasping his manicured hands together. "Look at it this way, buddy," he said, dropping the corporate facade and leaning into the cruelty. "You are out of your depth. You have been out of your depth since the day Chloe died. You play the tragic hero, but you are just a weak, broken guy who cannot even keep a roof over his daughter's head without my help." I kept my face completely blank. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to fill the void. "You know what happens if you do not sign, Caleb." Travis continued, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. "The bank takes the house. You go bankrupt. And when you do, Sarah and I will petition the family court for full custody of Lily. We will show the judge the Child Protective Services report from yesterday. We will tell them you are an unstable, traumatized veteran who cannot provide a safe environment for a 6-year-old girl. You will lose the house. You will lose the trust fund money. And you will lose your daughter. So pick up the pen and sign the damn paper." I had played his final card. He had laid out his absolute worst threats, believing they would crush whatever remaining resistance I had. He expected me to stammer. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for mercy, and then frantically sign away the only equity I had left in the world just to keep my child. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath. The mild-mannered, grieving corporate accountant evaporated completely into the chilled air of the boardroom. The deliberate slouch I had maintained for 2 years vanished. I rolled my shoulders back and stood to my full height. I looked directly into Travis's eyes, and for the first time since I had met him, I did not hide the predator inside me. I let him see the Green Beret medic who had dismantled threats in combat zones far darker than this country club. "I do not need your pen, Travis," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, almost a whisper, but it carried the chilling absolute certainty of a man who held a loaded weapon. Travis frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his heavily tanned face. "What are you talking about?" I reached inside the breast pocket of my custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. I did not pull out a pen. I withdrew a thick, dense folder sealed with a bright red tab. The color of the tab was a federal indicator for priority criminal evidence. I tossed the folder onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sliding directly over his fraudulent quitclaim deed and knocking his gold-plated pen onto the floor. "I brought my own paperwork," I said. Richard Belmont frowned, his legal instincts flaring. He looked at the red-tabbed folder, then up at me, sensing that the dynamic in the room had just violently shifted. "What is this, Mr. Sterling? Why do you not open it and find out?" Richard offered politely. Belmont hesitated, but his curiosity won out. He reached out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. The first page was not a property deed. It was a dense, highly technical spreadsheet displaying complex financial routing numbers, offshore shell company transfers, and corresponding dates, stretching back 3 years. It was a 40-page forensic audit compiled with the exact same software the federal government uses to track international terrorist funding. "What the hell is this garbage?" Travis snapped, trying to sound authoritative, but failing to hide the sudden tremor of anxiety in his voice. "Caleb, stop playing games and sign the transfer." I ignored Travis entirely and kept my eyes locked on the attorney. "You are a smart man, Mr. Belmont," I said quietly. "You handle commercial real estate law for high-net-worth clients, so you know exactly what a Ponzi scheme looks like when it is mapped out on paper." Belmont's head snapped up. He looked at me, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. He quickly looked back down at the audit, his fingers flipping rapidly through the pages. The color began to drain from his face as his trained eyes processed the sheer volume of financial data I had collected. "Let me walk you through it," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the soundproof room. "Page 4 details the life insurance trust fund that my late wife established for our daughter. $300,000 in cash, meant for a little girl's future. You will see on page 5 that your client, acting as co-trustee, drained that entire account 6 months ago and replaced the cash with worthless promissory notes from his own failing limited liability company. That is a textbook breach of fiduciary duty and a massive federal felony." Travis stood up so fast, his leather chair crashed backward into the glass wall. "You hacked my he yelled, his face turning a mottled, violent red. "You broke into my private network. This is illegal. This is inadmissible in court. It is entirely admissible when the evidence is provided to federal authorities under the Whistleblower Protection Act," I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with his lawyer. "Keep reading, Richard. Page 12 is where it gets truly interesting." Belmont turned to page 12. His hands were visibly shaking now. A light sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. He was realizing that he was sitting in a locked room with a client who had not just bent civil regulations, but had committed crimes that carried decades of mandatory federal prison time. Page 12 tracks the money your client has been raising from the elderly widows in our church congregation, I explained, pointing to the crowd visible through the glass floor beneath us. He convinced dozens of senior citizens to mortgage their paid-off homes to invest in a guaranteed commercial development down in Austin. But the audit proves that not a single dollar ever went to construction. Your client used the new investment money to pay fake dividends to the early investors while funneling the rest into his personal accounts to pay for his Porsche, his mansion, and his custom velvet jackets. He stole over $3 million from the most vulnerable people in his own community. "This is a lie!" Travis screamed, slamming his fists down on the mahogany table. Richard, do not listen to this psycho. He is a traumatized veteran. He is making this all up because he is terrified of losing his kid. Belmont did not answer. He could not answer. The numbers on the page were absolute. The routing data, the wire transfer receipts, the fraudulent corporate filings were all verifiable, undeniable proof of a massive affinity fraud scheme. As an officer of the court, Belmont knew that simply being in the same room as these documents put his own law license in severe jeopardy if he did not immediately distance himself from the crime. But I had saved the most devastating piece of evidence for last. "Turn to page 38, Richard," I commanded. Belmont swallowed hard and turned to the back of the folder. He found a single isolated legal document inside a plastic protective sleeve. It was the commercial loan guarantee for the failed Austin project. The loan for $500,000 that had originally triggered the bank foreclosure on my house. "Look at the signature line at the bottom of the guarantor agreement," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet intensity. "That is my late wife's signature. She supposedly signed that document to guarantee your client's massive commercial debt." Belmont squinted at the signature, then looked at the date stamp on the document. I could see the exact moment the math clicked in his head. "My wife died of pancreatic cancer on November 14th. I stated, laying out the timeline with clinical precision. That document is digitally time-stamped and notarized on October 28th. During that entire week, my wife was in a medically induced coma in the intensive care unit at Dallas Presbyterian Hospital. She was physically incapable of holding a pen, let alone executing a complex commercial loan guarantee. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was so quiet, I could hear the rapid, shallow breathing of the attorney. "Your client forged the signature of his dying sister-in-law to fraudulently secure $500,000 from a federally insured regional bank," I said. "He committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. And then he had the unmitigated audacity to try and use that forged debt to extort me out of the deed to my family home." Travis was hyperventilating now. His chest heaved beneath his expensive tuxedo shirt. He looked wildly between me and his lawyer, desperately searching for a way out of the trap he had blindly walked into. "Richard," he gasped, his voice tight with panic. "Richard, say something. Do something. Tell him you are going to sue him for defamation." Belmont did not look at Travis. He turned to the very last page in the red-tabbed folder. It was the single sheet of thick parchment paper bearing the official gold seal of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas. "I brought my own paperwork," I repeated softly. Belmont read the document. It was a federal asset freeze order signed by a federal magistrate judge just 4 hours ago. The order authorized the immediate seizure of all personal and corporate bank accounts, real estate holdings, and physical assets tied to Travis and his limited liability companies. It also served as a precursor to a sealed federal indictment for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The lawyer went completely pale. The last traces of his arrogant country club swagger vanished entirely. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a live landmine and heard the internal mechanism click. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that Travis was going to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. He also knew that the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division would be dismantling every single person connected to Travis's business empire. Belmont dropped the red-tabbed folder onto the table as if the paper itself was burning his fingers. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He moved with frantic, uncoordinated speed snapping his Italian leather briefcase shut and grabbing his tailored overcoat from the back of the chair. "Richard, where are you going?" Travis demanded, his voice cracking with hysteria. "We have a contract. You work for me. You have to fix this." Belmont finally looked at his client. There was no loyalty in his eyes, only the desperate self-preservation of a rat abandoning a sinking ship. The lawyer's face was a mask of sheer terror. "I am recusing myself," Belmont stammered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "I am formally terminating our attorney-client relationship effective immediately." I have absolutely no knowledge of these financial transactions. I am not a part of this. You cannot leave me here, Travis screamed, lunging across the table and trying to grab the attorney's sleeve. Belmont violently yanked his arm away, knocking over his own glass of water in his desperate rush for the door. Do not contact my office, Belmont shouted over his shoulder. You need a federal criminal defense attorney, Travis, and you need one right now. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, and Richard Belmont bolted into the hallway, sprinting toward the exit, and leaving Travis entirely alone in the glass cage he had built for me. Richard Belmont fled the executive suite with the frantic energy of a man outrunning a burning building. When the heavy wooden door sealed behind him, the click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the soundproof room. All the ambient noise from the charity gala taking place directly beneath us was completely severed. The sudden quiet was absolute and suffocating. I remained standing at the far end of the long conference table. I kept my posture relaxed. My hands rested loosely at my sides. I was projecting the unyielding discipline of a man who had spent a decade operating in the most unforgiving combat zones on the planet. I was no longer the grieving, overwhelmed corporate compliance officer my brother-in-law thought he had cornered. I was a mirror reflecting his absolute and total destruction. Travis was now entirely alone with me. He stood paralyzed at the head of the massive table. His perfectly manicured hands were shaking with a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. He stared down at the dense red folder I had placed before him, as if it contained a live explosive device. The documents scattered across the polished wood were not simply legal papers. They were the meticulously assembled instruments of his complete financial and social execution. Slowly fighting against his own body, he picked up the federal asset freeze order. His dark eyes darted frantically across the crisp, black text. I could see his mind racing. I was desperately searching the margins for a loophole, a typographical error, a tiny sliver of legal hope he could exploit to slip out of the snare. There was absolutely nothing to find. I watched him process the devastating, inescapable reality. Every single bank account bearing his name was permanently locked by the United States government. His sprawling, fraudulent commercial real estate empire was dead. His malicious theft from my 6-year-old daughter trust fund and his systematic robbery of the trusting elderly widows in our church congregation was completely and undeniably exposed to federal authorities. For a man who had spent his entire adult life building an identity on the fragile, glittering illusion of wealth and superiority, the unvarnished truth was a lethal dose of poison. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall behind him, we could clearly see the charity gala continuing in the grand ballroom. The very people Travis had callously robbed over the past 3 years were drinking expensive wine, laughing and embracing one another. They were entirely unaware that the man they were about to honor as Community Leader of the Year was currently watching his entire universe evaporate into thin air. I witnessed his psychological collapse happen in real time. It was a spectacular and terrifying unraveling. The arrogant, condescending smirk that Travis always wore as a shield vanished completely. It was replaced by a pale, sickening dread that drained the expensive artificial tan right out of his face. But men like my brother-in-law do not possess the emotional maturity or the moral fiber required to accept the consequences of their own actions. When a deep-seated narcissist is violently stripped of their power and backed into a corner with absolutely no avenue of escape, their panic does not manifest as remorse. It rapidly and violently transforms into a blinding primal rage. He desperately needed someone to blame for his monumental failure. He needed a victim to absorb the catastrophic impact of his collapsing world. Travis slowly lifted his heavy head and locked his furious eyes on me. His face had morphed into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The skin around his collar flushed a deep mottled purple. The thick veins at his temples throbbed visibly against his skin. His entitled, delusional mind refused to compute the reality of the situation. He did not see a highly trained tactical military operator standing across from him. He still only saw the quiet, broken widower he had pushed around in a suburban kitchen just 1 week ago. He genuinely believed he was still the strongest, most dangerous man in the room. He believed he could still use raw physical violence to force the world back into a shape that suited his massive ego. "You did this to me," he hissed. His voice vibrated with a guttural, animalistic fury that seemed to rattle the heavy glass walls of the boardroom. "You pathetic, weak little man. You think you can take my life away. You think you can walk into my world, destroy my business, and just leave without paying the price." I did not raise my voice. I did not shift my weight, take a step backward, or show a single ounce of intimidation. "You did this to yourself, Travis," I replied. My voice was remarkably smooth and chillingly quiet, echoing cleanly in the vast room. "You stole my daughter's future without a second thought. You callously forged your dying sister's signature while she fought for her last breath in an intensive care unit. I am not destroying your life. I am simply the natural consequence of your own boundless greed." That statement was the absolute breaking point. The truth was far too bright, too heavy, and too undeniable for his fragile ego to endure for another second. Travis let out a sound that was half scream and half animal roar. Driven entirely by narcissistic madness, he lunged wildly toward the heavy mahogany credenza positioned against the glass wall. Sitting on top of the polished wood was a pair of decorative solid brass bookends shaped like soaring eagles. Each one easily weighed 5 or 6 pounds of dense, unyielding metal. Travis wrapped his large right hand around the brass base and hoisted the heavy eagle high into the air. He turned back toward me, raising the heavy metal object above his shoulder like a primitive, deadly club. He was going to make good on the violent threat he had whispered to me at the Sunday barbecue. He was going to crush my skull, put me in a wheelchair, and take my daughter away from me. I saw the absolute, unmistakable, murderous intent burning in his eyes. With a final furious scream that bounced off the soundproof glass, he charged across the room. Travis closed the distance between us with the reckless, uncoordinated speed of a man consumed entirely by blind rage. He swung the solid brass bookend in a massive, sweeping downward arc, aimed directly at the side of my head. It was a brutal, desperate blow meant to shatter bone, cause permanent brain damage, and end my life. He fully expected me to cower in fear. He expected me to raise my hands in a desperate, terrified plea for mercy. I expected the mild-mannered suburban accountant to crumble instantly under his sheer physical dominance. Instead, the grieving corporate widower vanished entirely, and the Green Beret medic took the floor. When you spend 8 years in the United States Army Special Forces conducting high-stakes, close-quarters combat operations, your body learns to process violence entirely differently than a normal civilian. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic, anxiety, or hesitation. The sudden spike of adrenaline did not cloud my thoughts. Time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. My brain instantly calculated the trajectory of his swinging arm, the exposed vulnerability of his shifting weight, and the exact amount of kinetic force required to neutralize the incoming threat. It was pure, cold, absolute muscle memory taking over my physical form. I did not step backward to run away from the weapon. I stepped forward, moving aggressively and directly inside his guard. It is the exact opposite of what human survival instinct dictates, but it is the fundamental rule of close combat. I raised my left forearm, intercepting his wrist before the heavy brass bookend could build its maximum deadly momentum. The impact jarred my bone, but I absorbed the shock, instantly locking his arm firmly in place. Simultaneously, I drove the rigid heel of my right hand squarely into his sternum, knocking the wind completely out of his lungs. He let out a sharp, wet gasp as his forward momentum was violently and painfully arrested. Travis' eyes widened in profound, absolute shock. The confusion on his face was almost comical. He simply could not comprehend how the weak, grieving man he had bullied was suddenly an immovable object made of iron and clinical discipline. But I did not give his brain time to process the violent shift in reality. In one fluid, continuous motion, I trapped his attacking arm, wrapping my iron grip tightly around his wrist and twisting sharply outward to control his shoulder. At the exact same moment, I swept my right leg hard behind his ankle, completely destroying his center of gravity. Travis went airborne. He slammed into the thick carpet of the boardroom floor with a heavy, sickening thud that rattled the massive mahogany table. The solid brass bookend slipped from his numb fingers and rolled harmlessly away, hitting the wooden baseboard with a dull clank. Before he could even attempt to draw a breath or scramble away, I descended upon him. I dropped my knee directly onto his ribcage, pinning him flat and helpless to the floor. I pulled his right arm aggressively across his own back, applying a highly technical, deeply painful shoulder submission hold. I locked his joint at a severe angle that offered him two very simple choices. He could remain perfectly completely still, or he could try to fight back and instantly shatter his own rotator cuff. The entire violent sequence from the moment he swung the heavy brass weapon to the moment he was completely neutralized took less than 3 seconds. Travis let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream that echoed loudly off the soundproof glass walls. He writhed beneath me, trying desperately to free himself, but the mechanical leverage I held over his body was absolute and unforgiving. I was a large man, a man used to using his physical size and his stolen wealth to intimidate everyone around him. But right now, pinned to the floor in his ruined velvet tuxedo, he was utterly and entirely powerless. I leaned down, putting my face just inches from his ear. My breathing was perfectly steady. My heart rate had barely elevated from a normal resting pulse. I spoke in a voice as calm and quiet as a winter morning, ensuring he heard every single syllable over his own pathetic sobbing. "I told you, Travis," I whispered directly into his ear. "I am not the man you thought I was. You wanted to put me in a wheelchair. You wanted to use the state government to take my little girl away from me. You made a fatal miscalculation. Real strength does not need to boast, threaten, or bully. Real strength only strikes when the innocent are threatened, and you are completely out of your depth." He sobbed uncontrollably. The great wealthy untouchable community leader was weeping hysterically on the floor, his hot tears soaking into the expensive corporate carpet. "Please," he gasped, his voice cracking with intense physical pain and profound, shattering humiliation. "Please, Caleb, you are hurting me. Let me go. I am sorry. I am so sorry." I did not release the painful pressure on his shoulder. I held him there firmly, forcing him to endure the absolute reality of his complete and total defeat. For a few long, agonizing seconds, the boardroom was filled only with the sound of Travis crying and pleading. He was begging for mercy from the very man he had meticulously planned to destroy. He was a ruthless, arrogant bully who had finally encountered a massive stone wall he could not tear down. He lay there, defeated, broken his grand illusions of superiority and invincibility, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Then the doors of the executive boardroom burst violently open. They did not just open. They slammed against the interior walls with a concussive boom that rivaled the thunder of a massive summer storm. Travis flinched violently beneath me, letting out another pathetic, terrified cry. Striding into the room with an overwhelming, commanding presence was my old Special Forces brother, Elias. He was no longer wearing the sharp civilian suit he had worn during our strategic planning session. He was wearing heavy, dark, tactical gear with the letters Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division emblazoned in bold, bright yellow print across the front of his ballistic vest. His gold federal badge hung heavily from a chain around his neck, bouncing aggressively against his chest. Flanking him were 3 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, moving into the space with the sharp, coordinated precision of a highly seasoned raid team. "Federal agents!" Elias shouted, his voice booming with undeniable, absolute authority that commanded instant compliance. "Nobody move." The agents fanned out instantly, securing the perimeter of the room and blocking the single exit. One of the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and moved swiftly toward the center of the room where we were positioned on the floor. I looked down at Travis one last time. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared at the Federal tactical team flooding into his private sanctuary. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a freight train. He finally understood that I had not just defeated him physically in a brief, brutal fight. I had orchestrated his absolute, total, and permanent ruin. I smoothly released the painful tension on his shoulder joint. I stood up, stepping back from his trembling, sobbing form. I casually adjusted the cuffs of my tailored tuxedo jacket, smoothing the pristine black fabric as if I had merely tripped and gracefully recovered my balance. I looked at Elias and gave my old friend a single sharp nod of confirmation. "He is all yours," I said calmly. The agents descended upon Travis immediately. They grabbed his arms, roughly dragging his heavy, uncooperative frame up from the carpet. Travis offered absolutely zero physical resistance. His legs were shaking so violently, he could barely stand on his own 2 feet. They spun him around, pressing him hard against the smooth edge of the mahogany conference table. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly, ratcheting tight around his wrists and locking his hands securely behind his back. "Travis Sterling Elias," announced, reading loudly from a laminated card he pulled from his tactical vest pocket. "You are under arrest by order of the United States Federal Court. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Travis was crying openly and loudly now, making pathetic, desperate choking sounds. The tears smeared his expensive cologne and completely ruined his perfectly manicured appearance. He looked absolutely nothing like the charismatic, powerful real estate mogul who had stood on a stage downstairs confidently accepting philanthropic awards. He looked exactly like a small, terrified child who had finally been caught stealing from people who could not defend themselves. The cold click of federal steel snapping around Travis' wrists was the most satisfying sound I had heard in 2 years. It was a sharp mechanical noise that echoed perfectly off the mahogany walls of the executive boardroom. For months, this man had tormented my family. He had stolen the financial future my late husband left for our daughter Lily. He had forged documents to steal my home. I had even called Child Protective Services on me, attempting to weaponize my military service and my status as a widowed single mother to take my child away. He had done all of this with the arrogant smirk of a man who believed the rules did not apply to him. But as the lead FBI agent secured the cuffs tight against his skin, that smirk melted into something pathetic. Travis was no longer the untouchable commercial real estate developer. I was no longer the charismatic church leader who preyed on the elderly. He was just a coward pinned to the floor, weeping openly as the reality of a federal indictment crashed down upon him. My old military buddy, now a senior agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, stood over him. He read Travis his rights in a voice devoid of any emotion. I stood a few feet away, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored tuxedo jacket. I had dressed specifically for this occasion. For years, my in-laws had mocked my modest wardrobe, assuming my quiet life meant I was weak. They mistook my discipline for submission. They did not understand that a former combat medic does not panic under fire. We observe, we plan, and we strike with absolute precision only when necessary. Tonight was necessary. "Get him up," the lead FBI agent ordered. 2 agents hauled Travis to his feet. His designer suit was rumpled, his expensive tie twisted askew. His face was blotchy and red-stained with tears and sweat. He refused to look at me. The bravado that had fueled him just minutes prior when he tried to bash my head in with a solid brass bookend had completely evaporated. "We are taking the front stairs," the IRS agent said, looking at me with a slight nod of respect. "Let the whole room see exactly who they have been dealing with." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Beyond them lay the sweeping grand staircase that descended directly into the main ballroom of the Dallas Country Club. Down below, the annual spring charity gala was in full swing. The room was a sea of extravagant wealth and carefully curated social status. 300 guests were mingled among tables draped in fine silk and topped with towering floral arrangements. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne. A 12-piece jazz band was playing a lively tune on the main stage. The entire event was supposed to be the crowning moment of Travis' career. In less than an hour, he was scheduled to take that stage and receive the Community Leader of the Year award. He had invited all the local politicians, the wealthy church elders, and the elderly widows, whose life savings he had secretly drained to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had wanted them all here to witness his glory. Now they were going to witness his destruction. The agents pushed Travis forward. We stepped out of the private corridor and onto the landing of the grand staircase. At first, no one below noticed us. The music was too loud, the conversations too animated. But as we began the descent, the visual of 3 federal agents escorting a handcuffed man in a tuxedo caught the eye of a woman standing near the bottom steps. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass caused the people around her to turn. One by one, the guests looked. The laughter began to die. The conversation sputtered and faded as the realization of what they were looking at spread through the crowd like a cold wind. The jazz band conductor, noticing the sudden shift in the room, turned his head. His baton faltered. The brass section trailed off. The piano player hit one final discordant chord before stopping completely. Within 30 seconds, a ballroom containing 300 people fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. The only sound left was the heavy thud of the FBI agents' tactical boots and the scuffing of Travis' expensive leather shoes as they marched him down the marble stairs. I walked 2 steps behind them, holding my head high. I looked out over the crowd. I saw the faces of those people I recognized from our megachurch. I saw the elderly women who had trusted Travis with their late husband's pensions, believing his charming smile and his promises of guaranteed real estate returns. I saw their expressions shift from confusion to dawning horror as they stared at the handcuffs binding the wrists of the man they had trusted. Travis tried to duck his head, trying to hide his face from the people he had robbed, but the agents kept him moving straight forward, forcing him to walk the gauntlet of his own ruined reputation. When we reached the ballroom floor, the crowd physically parted. People took hurried steps backward as if Travis were suddenly contagious. The sea of wealthy donors and socialites split wide open, creating a clear path toward the main entrance. No one spoke a word. The collective shock was paralyzing. These were people who believed that federal raids and handcuffs only happened to other people in other neighborhoods. Seeing it happen to one of their own in the middle of a black tie gala shattered their carefully constructed reality. Then a voice shattered the silence. Travis. The scream was high-pitched and frantic. From the far side of the ballroom, Sarah broke through the crowd. My sister-in-law looked terrified and furious all at once. She was wearing a custom designer gown that likely cost more than my first car funded by the money they had stolen from my daughter. She ran toward us, her high heels clicking wildly against the floor. She did not look at the FBI agents. She did not look at the IRS criminal investigator. She locked her eyes entirely on me. "What did you do?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "What lies did you tell them? Tell them to let him go right now." She reached out, trying to grab the arm of the lead agent, but he stepped in front of Travis, forming a solid wall. "Ma'am, step back," the agent commanded, his voice booming through the quiet ballroom. "I is a good man," Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "He is receiving an award tonight. You cannot do this. She is crazy. She is a traumatized veteran who makes things up. She is just jealous of us. Tell them, Travis. Tell them she is lying." Travis did not say a word. He just kept his head down, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound that made my stomach turn. Sarah turned back to the agents, her face twisted with a mixture of entitlement and panic. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, stamping her foot. "Do you know who we are? Do you know who my husband is? I demand to know what she accused him of." The lead FBI agent had clearly lost his patience. He stood tall, adjusting his stance so his voice would carry to every single person in that silent room. "Ma'am, your husband is not being arrested based on accusations," he stated loudly, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Your husband is being indicted by a federal grand jury for operating a $14 million affinity fraud and Ponzi scheme. He is also being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the forgery of loan documents. We have seized his business records, and a federal magistrate has already frozen every bank account under his name, your name, and his corporate entities." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. $14 million. Wire fraud. Identity theft. The whispers erupted immediately. The crowd of 300 people began to murmur furiously, pointing at Sarah and Travis. I watched the faces of the elderly church members, the widows who had handed over their retirement checks. The confusion in their eyes turned to pure, undisguised hatred. "No," Sarah gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. "No, that is not true. We have real estate. We have investments. Your husband has nothing," the IRS agent chimed in, his voice equally loud and clear. "He drained the trust funds of innocent children, and he stole the life savings of the people in this very room to pay for your mansion and your cars. It is all gone, ma'am." Sarah looked at Travis, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for him to deny it. Travis, tell them it is a mistake," she begged. But Travis just sobbed, letting his chin rest against his chest. "I am sorry," he whispered weakly. "I am so sorry, Sarah." The reality of the situation finally broke through her denial. The grand illusion she had built her entire life upon, the wealth, the status, the superiority she had lorded over me for years, collapsed in an instant. Her legs gave out. Sarah collapsed onto the marble floor of the country club, the layers of her expensive gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She put her hands over her face and began to wail a terrible hollow sound of complete social and financial ruin. But the most striking part was the reaction of the crowd. In the past, if Sarah had so much as tripped over her own feet, a dozen people would have rushed forward to help her up. She was the queen of their social circle. But tonight, no one moved. Not a single person stepped forward to comfort her. In fact, the people closest to her actually took a few steps back, widening the empty circle around her. The community she had prized above all else turned their backs on her immediately. They looked at her with disgust, seeing her not as a friend, but as the beneficiary of the money that had been stolen from their own pockets. "Move him out," the lead agent directed. The agents pulled Travis forward, marching him through the main doors of the ballroom and out toward the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting in the circular driveway. I watched them go, feeling the heavy weight I had been carrying for 6 months finally lift from my shoulders. The threat to my home was over. The threat to my daughter was gone. The people who had tried to destroy us had instead destroyed themselves. I did not stay to watch the rest of the fallout. I did not need to see Sarah weeping on the floor or the angry donors demanding answers. My mission was complete. I turned and walked toward the exit, moving through the crowd. As I walked, the wealthy guests and the church elders parted for me. Some of them looked at me with awe, some with fear, but none of them looked at me with pity anymore. They finally understood that the quiet, widowed mother they had ignored was the one who had single-handedly dismantled the biggest predator in their community. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the country club and stepped out into the night. The cool Texas air hit my face, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant rain. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. The flashing lights of the FBI vehicles were already fading down the long, winding driveway of the golf course, taking Travis away to a federal holding cell, where his money and his charm would mean absolutely nothing. I reached into the pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the darkness. There was a single text message waiting for me from Mrs. Higgins, the retired school teacher who lived next door and watched my daughter when I had to work late. Lily brushed her teeth and read her dinosaur book Mrs. Higgins had texted. "She is fast asleep now. Did not even fuss. Hope your event went well." I stared at the message and a genuine smile touched my face for the first time that day. I typed a quick reply confirming I was on my way home. I walked toward my car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. The contrast between the chaos I had just left inside that ballroom and the absolute peace waiting for me at home was profound. My daughter was sleeping safely in her own bed, completely unaware of the financial ruin that had almost stolen her home. She was unaware of the custody threats of the CPS visit, of the forged documents, and the stolen trust fund. She was just a little girl dreaming of dinosaurs, completely sheltered from the monsters that exist in the real world. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. I had done my job. I had protected my unit. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove out of the country club gates, leaving the wreckage of Travis and Sarah behind me in the dark. 6 months can feel like an absolute eternity when you are waiting for the heavy wheels of federal justice to finish turning. The changing seasons brought a crisp autumn chill to suburban Dallas, sweeping away the stifling summer heat, and with it, the final remnants of Travis and his empire of lies. I did not attend every single court hearing because I had a logistics firm to run and a 6-year-old daughter to raise. But my old Special Forces brother now, a senior agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, made sure I knew every detail of the dismantling. Travis spent those entire 6 months in a federal holding facility. No bail was ever granted. The federal magistrate, recognizing the extreme flight risk of a man facing decades behind bars for a $14 million affinity fraud, kept him firmly locked away in a concrete cell. The arrogant bravado. He once wore like a second skin completely dissolved in that environment. Faced with the massive mountain of forensic evidence, the undeniable proof of forged signatures, and the heartbreaking testimonies of the elderly church members, he had bled dry. His high-priced defense strategy completely crumbled. He realized no amount of smooth talking could charm the federal government. Driven into a corner with absolutely no leverage left, Travis took a plea deal to avoid a guaranteed 30-year sentence. I took a half-day off from the office to attend his final sentencing. The federal courthouse in downtown Dallas was a stark, unforgiving contrast to the lavish country club where I had last seen him. When the marshals brought him out, he looked completely hollowed out. The charismatic commercial real estate developer was gone forever, replaced by a defeated pale man shuffling in an oversized orange jumpsuit. His shoulders were slumped and he kept his eyes glued to the polished floor, refusing to look at the gallery where the widows he had robbed were sitting. The judge did not mince words. She spoke forcefully of the sacred trust he had violated, deliberately preying on vulnerable families and utilizing his standing in the church as a weapon of financial destruction. She sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no early release for good behavior. He would spend the next decade and a half locked away, stripped of the power, the money, and the social prestige he had valued above human decency. Watching him being led away in heavy steel chains, I felt no joy. There is never any real joy in watching a human life waste away. But there was a profound, undeniable sense of absolute finality. The predator was finally caged, and my family was permanently safe. The fallout for his wife, Sarah, was equally absolute, though it played out on the brutal stage of public humiliation rather than a federal courtroom. Under the strict laws of asset forfeiture and restitution, the government systematically dismantled the luxurious life she had thought she was entitled to. I remember driving past their exclusive neighborhood a few weeks after the charity gala. The sprawling McMansion that had hosted so many arrogant Sunday barbecues had a massive federal seizure notice taped to the custom mahogany front door. The government auctioned off absolutely everything. The luxury cars, the designer furniture, the country club memberships, and the expensive jewelry were all liquidated to pay back the innocent victims of the Ponzi scheme. Sarah found herself entirely destitute overnight. The community she had prized above all else, the wealthy socialites and the mega-church elite, turned their backs on her with lightning speed. People who had once kissed her cheek at charity events now crossed the street to avoid her. She was completely excommunicated from the only world she cared about. With her husband in federal prison and all their bank accounts frozen, Sarah was forced to face the harsh reality of the real world she used to mock. She had to move out of the affluent suburbs and into a tiny, cramped apartment on the edge of the city. To pay her rent and buy groceries, the former queen of the local social scene had to take a job working retail at a discount clothing store. A neighbor told me they saw her there one afternoon, standing behind a cash register, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, looking exhausted and broken as she folded clearance sweaters. She had built her entire identity on looking down at people like me, assuming my quiet life meant I was beneath her. Now she was experiencing the very struggles she had once laughed at. I did not pity her. She had been perfectly willing to let my daughter lose her future and let my home be foreclosed upon just to maintain her grand illusion of wealth. She was exactly where she deserved to be, learning the hard lessons of humility that the universe inevitably teaches those who lack a moral compass. While their world collapsed into ruin, mine was finally secured and restored. Because I had utilized my corporate compliance software and my military open-source intelligence training to uncover the fraud. Early, the federal receiver was able to track down the stolen funds before Travis could completely launder them away through offshore accounts. The legal process was tedious, involving endless stacks of paperwork and long meetings with federal auditors, but the outcome was everything I had fought for. The receiver successfully clawed back the money Travis had drained from my late wife Chloe's trust fund. The entire $300,000 was restored to Lily's account completely intact and legally shielded by a new independent trustee preventing any future manipulation. Furthermore, the federal court ordered that all my legal fees be fully reimbursed from the assets seized from Travis. I did not lose a single penny defending my family. The most monumental relief, however, came in the form of a certified letter from the bank holding the commercial loan. The rigorous forensic audit had unequivocally proven that Chloe's signature on the origination documents was a deliberate forgery executed weeks before she passed away. The bank, facing intense federal scrutiny for their massive failure to verify the legal documents, immediately invalidated the loan. The fraudulent lien on my home was wiped completely clean. I will never forget the evening I received that official letter. I stood in my modest kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked countless meals for my daughter, and held the single sheet of paper that declared my home was permanently safe. I walked into the living room where Lily was sitting on the rug coloring a picture of a dinosaur, completely oblivious to the massive unseen war that had been fought and won for her future. I sat down on the floor beside her, breathing in the sweet scent of crayons and childhood innocence, and felt a mountain of anxiety lift completely off my chest. I had kept my silent promise to my late wife. Our daughter was protected. Her financial inheritance was safe. Her childhood remained untouched by the greed of a desperate, manipulative man. We were free to just live our lives in peace. In the quiet months that followed the trial, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the true nature of power. Society often glorifies the loud, the aggressive, and the men who puff out their chests and use verbal intimidation to get exactly what they want. Men like Travis truly believe that strength is measured by how hard you can grip someone by the shoulder, by how loudly you can threaten a widowed father in a kitchen, and by the expensive tailored suits you wear to project dominance. They constantly mistake arrogance for authority. But my time in the military, serving as a Green Beret combat medic in environments far more hostile than a Dallas country club, taught me a very different truth. True power is never loud. It does not need to scream for attention or resort to petty aggressive threats. Real strength is quiet. It is deeply disciplined. It observes the battlefield, it calculates the risks, and it remains perfectly composed under intense pressure. True strength is having the capacity for total, absolute destruction, but keeping it firmly sheathed until it is absolutely necessary to protect the people who matter most. When Travis pushed his thumb directly into my old bullet wound scar, he thought my silence was cowardice. He did not realize it was tactical restraint. You do not have to react to every single provocation. You do not have to let arrogant bullies dictate your emotions or force you into a premature fight. You simply gather your evidence, secure your defensive position, and strike with absolute devastating precision when the time is exactly right to end the threat permanently. I am sharing this chapter of my life not for the sake of revenge, but for the countless others out there who might be facing their own bullies right now. Whether it is a corrupt family member, a toxic business partner, or an arrogant manipulator who thinks they can walk all over you, remember that their volume does not equal victory. Your quiet discipline is your greatest weapon. You have the right to protect your home, your family, and your peace of mind, and you do not have to apologize for dismantling the people who try to destroy you. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you believe that true strength lies in protecting your family, and if you absolutely love seeing arrogant bullies get a heavy dose of reality, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I really want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me what city or state you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Stay strong, Keep your head up and always protect your peace.